arriving, I enter a small town that I have no knowledge of. The only thing that I remember clearly about it, though, was that there were a few medicinal marijuana dispensaries, and it had a lot of old buildings, almost all of them with large old fences and gates. Weirdly, I can't seem to find this on the map, but if any of you guys have any ideas, then please do let me know. So, I drove into town already feeling creeped out. The residents would sort of shuffle about and stare, and there were very few new buildings, but that wasn't the creepy part. You see, on almost every sidewalk corner and road, there were dead dogs, all wearing a leash and a collar. No blood, no slashes, bites or gunshot wounds or anything, just dead dogs everywhere. I stopped at one of the traffic lights in town and took in the greater picture. The people, as I said, just sort of shuffled and it just seemed wrong. But then the horror hit me. There were 20 plus dead dogs easily, and from what I could make out, there was just no logical reason or conclusion for this to happen. One or maybe two would make sense, I suppose, but it was like 20 plus. In fact, almost every lawn there was a dead dog there. Not just one breed in particular, too. It varied from miniature poodles up to Rottweilers and Labradors. I also noticed that nobody seemed to care. Mind you, and again, it was not just one dog. There was no way of ignoring it. But again, they all had leashes and collars, and I just cannot emphasize enough how weird this was. They were actually everywhere, and they were on street corners, yards, corners, middle of the road, parking lots. I drove through the town with no issues, mind you, but I attempted to find the town before sharing this, and I've still had no luck finding it, which is weird because I should be able to find it easily. I mean, it's on a common route that I've taken before. The next time I go up to see my mum, I'm going to attempt to track down this town and possibly give all of you guys an update. My theory is that it's either a cult or a major meth or drug epidemic in that town. But if you have any information or ideas of where this actually happened and how I could find it again, then please do share it, because I do plan to go back. So for context, I'm 26 and I met my stalker at the ages of 14 or 15. When I was 14, I decided to take ballroom dance classes at one point. That was kind of normal for teenagers in my generation in my country, but there you had to change partners each song, so every girl would dance with every boy. And in my group, that consisted of mostly teens between 14 to 17, there was a really tall, almost 2 meters, 21-year-old old guy. His name was Philip. We had a nice chat the times that we danced, but he seemed sort of weird. And because I was young and naive, and that's how I normally made friends, I told him where I lived when he asked me. And so, the stalking began. At the time, I didn't realize that it was stalking. I just thought that he had too much time on his hands and that it was just annoying. But Philip would ride on his bike from his home, he lived one town over, to my house, and ask if I wanted to spend time outside with him and play. After doing that for a few times, I asked my parents to tell him that I just wasn't home when he would come over. Both my parents and I were very oblivious about his actions for a very, very long time, too. At one point in time, the stalking ended for a few weeks, and Philip also didn't come to dance classes. At that time, I became a part of a friend group of a boy I fancied. For some months, he had a girlfriend, but they split soon after, and I became his girlfriend. Unfortunately, though, Philip was also friends with the best friend of my boyfriend, so he was also part of that group. And they told me Philip was in a mental hospital, apparently, and in the span of his stalking, Philip had actually been put into a mental hospital multiple times, and every time that he was, to be honest, I was kind of thankful, because then I at least had some peace. When I was 16, my family and I had to move because our landlady had thrown us out. She wanted to live in the property herself, so we moved one town over. And unfortunately, we began living 2 streets apart from my stalker. And every time Philip was out of the hospital, he would be at my house again. It was not as often, but still, it was enough to be annoying. At my father's birthday, though, he rang again, and because my family had guessed, they told me to open the door, and there he was, looming over me like a dark, menacing shadow man. I told him to leave, and I tried to close the door, but he blocked it. So I was standing there, afraid, sort of begging him to leave. And at one point, I even ran inside to get my dad to send him away, but my dad said, "He's your friend, so it's your problem." So I went back to the door, and again, I basically pleaded that Philip please leave. At one point, he was sort of kneeling and sitting on my doorway, and after almost 2 hours, he finally left. It was obvious to me at that point too and I finally realized what type of behavior it was, that he was a stalker and he was fixated on me. The next day I sat down with my parents and I told them that I was afraid of Philip, and my dad also apologized to me for putting me in that situation and not helping me. The next time Philip came to my house, my dad was there and told him that I do not want any contact with him, and so he left. And after a few more incidences like that, he stopped showing up at my door, and honestly, I thought that I'd got rid of him. But every time I started to live happily, started to forget my fear of him, a letter, an email, or a gift showed up and would send me straight back into my fears. At 20, I was out of school, and to pass the year I had to wait to start my job, and I worked in a grade school in a voluntary sort of position, after school care club for grade schoolers. After a month or 2, my mum woke me up in the morning and she told me to get dressed because she had apparently called the cops. Apparently, Philip was again every single morning at our door and had even asked for me, and my parents didn't tell me so I wouldn't get scared again, but finally, after the cops told Philip 3 times to leave, and he ignored them, mind you, they arrested him, and he screamed and screamed my name and that he was burning for me and that the cops hurt him, and he just carried on like crazy. My parents and I were standing in the kitchen listening. The situation was so absurd and so much for me that I just started laughing sort of hysterically. We filed a report at the police for stalking and trespassing, but the officer said that they couldn't really do anything because he hadn't hurt me physically. We tried to get a restraining order too, but in the end it didn't go through, and a week later, Philip had snuck into our garden and, like in a movie, he threw rocks at my window. Throwing rocks at a girl's window is not romantic. It's creepy. Don't do it, guys. But idiot me opened the window and didn't see anything until it clicked, and I ran downstairs and told my dad that he was in the garden again. This time, he escaped. A week after that, I was in the kitchen cooking when Philip rang the doorbell again, and because we have no way of seeing who was at the door, I opened it. And there he was again, telling me that he missed me, and saying that he had peeked through the blinds of the windows in the living room the past week to see if I was there. My parents weren't home at that point. If they had been, I would have ran, but like this, I had to swallow my fear and stand in the doorway listening to Philip talk until my boyfriend, different boyfriend, he came over. I had sent him an SOS SMS and he was on his way. After my boyfriend arrived, he told Philip to leave, and he did. Philip mentioned in passing, though, that he now also has a girlfriend. And after that, I didn't see Philip again for a long time. But a friend told me that he was taken by the men in white coats because he had believed that his mum was possessed by the devil or something. I was glad to see the end of him, but man, that was a shock. It wasn't until 2 years later, too, when I got a letter from court. I was apparently a witness, and I was told to attend in the case of the assault of Philip. Apparently, after coming out of the mental hospital, he had a fight with his girlfriend and hit her, and because she was scared, she played dead apparently. Philip called an ambulance, and the police finally had something against him. After the hearing, he was admitted again to a mental hospital, and I finally got a restraining order, and he was ordered to stay at least 30 meters away from our property. I was really glad to hear this too, because the restraining order also implied that if he broke any of the requirements, he would go to jail. And so, finally, it was over. 2 years ago, I also moved out of my parents' house, and I'm sharing this only now because I believe that I'm actually seeing him again. But it can't be. He doesn't know where I live, and he also hasn't shown up at my parents' house, but I don't know. I think that I've seen him again when I've left my house a few times. I think that I just need reassurance that it's not him again, and I need to find a way to be safe at my home. If you guys have any ideas or any way that I can help myself, then please let me know. When I was 16, I decided to throw a small Halloween party. My dad agreed to leave me the house, and he was staying at for the day or night and went to stay in another town about 30 minutes drive away. It's worth noting too that the house was very isolated, abandoned looking, and pretty old as well. It was a small village and there were barely any neighbors. But around mid-afternoon, one of my friends came to help me prepare, and others were expected to arrive at night. Looking back, 2 16-year-old girls alone in an isolated house was always going to be a bad idea. But at some point, we were sitting on the couch chatting, and suddenly we heard a loud bang, and the living room got very dark. We turned around and saw that the outside heavy wooden shutters had been slammed shut. We instantly freaked out because it was a nice sunny day and there was absolutely no wind, so we knew that someone was outside and trying to scare us or watching us or something. We ran into the next room to hide, and we saw some shadows through the windows of that room walking around the house. At this point, we were terrified too because the front door wasn't locked and the bathroom window was broken, so the entire house was easy to break into. On top of all of that as well, the only place that we had service was upstairs in the corner room. Long story short though, we made our way to that room and I called my dad for help. Shortly after though, we heard the front gate creaking open and shutting, and we heard a car drive away. When we finally went back downstairs, the cops were there because my dad had sent them, but they never found anyone or cared much really anyway, since no one had been clearly seen and nothing had been stolen. But what's really weird to me is that the house was so easy to break into, but they never actually came in, it seems. Simply just watched us and walked around the house. But what shocked me the most, perhaps, is what happened a few days later. I was in that house with my dad and a friend of his came to see him, and at some point, he came in the living room and smiled at me weirdly and said, "Crazy how dark it gets here when the shutters are closed." And I just remember my blood freezing when I heard that. I never saw that guy again, and I never stayed in the house alone again, but sometimes I think that maybe we got lucky that nothing happened that night. This happened 2 years ago, but I've been struggling to sleep tonight, and I just keep thinking about it, so I'm gonna share it here. I was 17 and my family had just moved in with my mum's boyfriend into a house that he had just finished building. It's interesting to note too that my mum and her boyfriend, they had been dating for 2 years prior to this, and he was a really cool dude. My first night in the new house sure was a night though. The whole house had that feeling of uneasiness going on. It's also important to note that prior to this, I'd never experienced sleep paralysis. But when I woke up in the morning, I couldn't move, and I could also hear a dog breathing in my ear, and I could even feel its breath. So, sleep paralysis, right? Not the vibe that anyone wants, but still explainable. But well, it just got worse. Every single night I would wake up completely paralyzed with what sounded like a dog breathing in my ear again. It kept escalating, and one night I heard a dog running around on the floor. It was that sort of distinct claws on cement sound that dogs make, and Then eventually it got so bad that I was waking up multiple times a night to the feeling of something crawling into bed next to me and laying right up against me. I would also have a reoccurring nightmare of a black dog with 6 segments like a centipede talking to me. It was terrifying at first, but it became so frequent that in the end it just stopped freaking me out anymore. Still, it's just sleep paralysis, right? Well, at one point, the conversation came up about the history of the property, and according to Mum's boyfriend, a man had actually shot 6 dogs and then himself on the property. That definitely began to freak me out a bit. Me and my mum discussed all of this, and apparently she'd been seeing stuff in the house too. She always complained sounds would come from her room and that we couldn't figure out the cause of it. But the worst encounter was probably when we were sitting at the kitchen table and we heard what sounded like rummaging through her closet. The closet shares a wall with the kitchen and the walls are thin, so you could hear it. But it definitely wasn't a small animal or anything. It was like things were being picked up and moved and sort of thrashed about a bit. So naturally, I get my scrawny butt in there, armed with none other than a can of beans, and the second that I announce that I have a gun, a can of beans though, the sound stopped. But then we noticed that there was a box taken off the shelf and it was now set in the middle of the floor. Now, you know how I said that my mum's boyfriend was a cool dude? Well, he also started getting weird and his behavior kept escalating too until eventually we just had to leave in the middle of the night. I haven't gotten sleep paralysis since then too, and hopefully I won't ever again. When I was 12, I had some trouble sleeping due to stress from a major move. My family and I relocated to Perth, Australia. I no longer live there, and this was many years ago, but I would sit in bed with a small nightlight on, thinking until eventually I just got tired enough to fall asleep. Now, one night when everybody else was asleep, I heard a strange sound, and it was a voice saying, "What the F is going on?" in a really irritable way. I didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded like a young man. But the strange thing was that the voice kept repeating this phrase on and on, sort of like a recording. Just thinking about it too makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I didn't know where the voice was coming from. It sounded like it was outside, but because it sounded like a cheap recording, and because I thought that whatever speaker was used to produce the sound could not be that strong, I ended up surmising that the sound must be originating from directly outside of my window. When I came to that conclusion too, I just panicked. I mean, who could be the perpetrator? My neighbors to one side were sweet old people, the house on the other side was still under construction, and completely vacant at night. And it was way too far from my window to be making the noise. Initially, I tried to ignore the sound, thinking that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but it persisted. Eventually, it got too much, and I bolted out of bed and burst into my parents' room. They woke up to me telling them that there was a creepy sound outside, but suddenly it stopped, and nobody else heard it. To this day, I still don't have any answers. I admit that it may have just been an auditory hallucination, but nothing like it has ever happened to me before or since then, which makes me think that there was someone or something outside of my window that night, replaying that recording over and over again for who knows what reason. So my friend and I used to work together in a town quite far away from where we lived. To get there involved an approximately 90-minute journey, including a 45-minute train ride. One day I called in sick to work, meaning that my friend had to make the commute in by himself. When he got home that evening, he called me about an unsettling encounter that he had that morning. He told me of an old man on the train platform that had struck up a conversation with him, and the conversation was quite pleasant, so they ended up sharing a booth on the train. He described the old man as probably in his 70s, smartly dressed with a friendly demeanor. The conversation was the typical small talk you'd imagine having with a stranger. Are you on your way to work? What do you do? Do you like it there? And so on. When asked why he was traveling so far this early in the morning, the old man explained that his older brother is ill and so he visits him every day. Out of nowhere, the old man's demeanor apparently changed though, from laid back and friendly to very serious, perhaps even angry. He looked my friend dead in the eye and said, "A lot of men are accused of having intimacy with other men nowadays, aren't they?" There was a heavy emphasis on the "aren't they?" My friend was understandably uncomfortable with this question and unsure of what to say, but his discomfort made way for skin-crawling disgust when he noticed that the old man had put his hands on the table, revealing his fingers that looked like they'd been stained from several decades of smoking, and overgrown fingernails which were not only a little dirty under the white, but the entire nail plate was caked in dirt. My friend said that he mumbled some sort of non-answer and was then mercifully saved by the train stopping, which gave him an opportunity to escape from the old man, who himself said nothing. When he finished his story, I found it quite funny, to be honest, and didn't understand why he was so upset by some dirty old man trying to pick him up on the train. The next morning, we went to our usual busy platform and waited for the train to arrive. No sign of the old man. I left my friend briefly to go pick up a coffee and a newspaper. As I was reaching down to pick up the newspaper, I heard an unfamiliar voice ask, "Forget your newspaper?" I knew who it was immediately. I turned, and it was the old man that my friend had described. He had a creepy smirk on his face and winked at me. I just muttered something like, "Yeah," and walked away. As I did so, I tried to get a look at his hands, but they were covered by the sleeves of his jacket. I had to admit to being slightly creeped out by the old guy, especially knowing how he'd behaved the day before, but I still didn't think that there was any more on him than being just, at worst, a weird old pervert. But this changed that afternoon when both my friend and I received a call from him at work. It had to be him, where he simply said, "Getting warmer?" before hanging up. We continued to see the old man every day at the platform, but he never attempted to speak with either one of us ever again. Oddly, we never once witnessed him engage anyone else on the platform in conversation, and besides that first encounter with my friend, we never actually saw him on the train. We would sometimes see him on the destination platform, however, but after a while, we pretty much all but forgot about our experiences with the old man, and he even became something of a joke to us. We laughed at the things that he said, the funny way that he walked, and things like that. But one morning there was stormy weather, and the old man was not on the platform. We got on our train and began coming up with various silly reasons for why he wasn't there. This may sound a bit odd to you as well, but when you're traveling for 90 minutes with the same person every day, it can be difficult to find things to talk about, and you find yourself clinging onto any little thing really. Anyway, our train had various stops to make on its way to our destination, and after about 20 minutes or so, it started to slow down for one of them. We were talking and laughing about the old man. The train comes to a complete stop, and the old man is literally standing outside of our window looking in, his wispy white hair blowing in the wind, his mouth slightly open with his tongue gently resting on the inside of his lower lip like he was dehydrated, and his pale eyes were droopy and staring straight through us. That was the weirdest and probably the most terrifying thing about it too. It was like he didn't even notice that we were there. We looked back at him until the train pulled away from the platform, and he didn't move, not an inch, like weirdly still. I don't think he even blinked. We were obviously both pretty shaken up by this, and I can honestly say that it was the most startling and weird experience of my life. I don't know if you can relate to this too, but I think that we were both so scared by it that we didn't even really want to acknowledge it, so we didn't talk about it. I still don't understand why he'd be on a platform 20 miles away from his home at approximately 7:50 a.m. and why the train would just so happen to stop exactly where he was standing, as we were talking about him too. It was weird, but when our train arrived at our destination, we got off and made our way onto the bus which would take us to work. 2 stops later, the bus stops, and looking in our window once again is the old man. Same thing with his mouth, same dead stare. He didn't get on the bus, and the only possible way that he could have got there before us was if he took a cab from the train station, and even then I'm not sure it would have been quick enough. This time we did acknowledge it and we did talk about it, but we were no longer joking about it or laughing at the old man. We were pretty freaked out. After that day, we stopped talking about him entirely, and strangely enough, we never saw him ever again while we were working together. Many years later, though, my friend was making his way to a job interview in the middle of the day. When he arrived at the train station, he could barely believe his eyes when he saw the old man sitting on a bench at our old platform, one leg folded over the other like he hadn't a care in the world. He took a picture of him and sent it to me, and weirdly, the old man looked the same but was dressed like a complete slob. Some years after that, I had moved away but was back in town to visit someone. After getting off the train at the old platform, I began walking down the stairs when I noticed that the person directly in front of me was none other than the old man. During another visit, I stopped off somewhere for breakfast and noticed him sitting alone at a table. He didn't eat or drink, but after a while he got up, picked up an empty plate and cup from his table, and walked into the back of the place with me. None of the staff seemed to notice this, and the old man didn't come back out. Last year, my grandfather unfortunately passed away suddenly, and shortly after this, my grandmother took a very sudden turn for the worse herself. After a long stay in the hospital, she was put in a nursing home. Within days of her arrival, they were informed that Gran's life was coming to an end and encouraged us to be with her. I made my way there as soon as I could, and when I got out of the elevator on my Gran's floor, I once again saw the old man sitting in a chair. He wasn't looking at me or even in my direction. He was looking straight down at the floor. Resting on the sides of the chair were his arms, where I saw the stained fingers and long dirty nails. But when I came out of the room, he was gone, and I intended to return the next day, but Gran sadly passed away that evening. One other odd thing too is that Gran's usually manicured nails were also unkempt and dirty. Obviously, we couldn't expect her to take care of them in her state, but we were surprised and upset that the reputable nursing staff hadn't cleaned them. Anyway, I was at the old train station again today for the first time in who knows how long. I sort of half expected him to be there, as I've been thinking about him and mentioned him recently, but thankfully this time he wasn't. Now, I know that a lot of this is already strange enough as it is, but the weirdest thing is that every single time that I saw this guy, it just seemed like he never aged. Not one bit. This happened well over 20 years ago, but I remember most of the details as the imagery was seared into my brain. Call it a core memory, if you will. I was around 6 to 7 years old and living in a very quiet suburban area. My parents often entertained guests and drank beers in the kitchen all night, and their friends would often be the parents to the 2 of my best friends growing up. We were allowed way too much freedom as kids, and were often left alone for hours. Normally, we'd be just in the backyard playing since it was lit at night and enclosed by a tall fence, but it had rained hard that day, possibly still raining at this time too, and we weren't allowed out. So we tried to play hide and seek in my bedroom. We were not very inventive. In any case, to make the game harder, the seeker couldn't turn on the bedroom light and had to rely on the hall light and the very dim street light that comes in through one of the windows. As a hider, I immediately threw myself into the half-dozen pillows of my bed and hoped that they would conceal me better than my other hiding friend. No idea where he ended up. Soon enough, too, I heard the door open and could just barely see the hallway light coming in from between pillows. Way too many seconds passed without a sound, no rustling or signs of seeking, and so I peek out from my hiding spot to find myself completely alone in the room. And that was strange. I didn't have long to rack my tiny child mind for long though, because almost immediately my window caught my attention. There was a shadow slowly crossing in between the streetlight and my blinds in the shape of a head and a very distinctive long triangular shape being held up as if to strike. I get absolutely freaked out by this, scramble off my bed, and run into the kitchen where I see my two friends looking equally scared and confused. But I also noticed that the adults were laughing their heads off, so I began to relax at that. It was clearly just a prank, and they got me good. Wait, who had the knife? I ask, as I realize that someone could have gotten hurt since they were pretty darn buzzed at this point. The laughing stopped immediately, and every single person stared in my direction. I don't remember the conversation particularly well because my panic came back tenfold at this point, but apparently my other hiding friend saw the shadow in the window before he was able to hide and sprinted out of the room, leaving me, thanks bud, and he told the adults that he saw something in the window but they didn't take him seriously, just a kid's imagination. And as soon as I seemed to have corroborated the story, adding a knife into the mix, I was asked more questions while the husbands ran outside to see if anyone was in the yard. Nothing was found outside. The area in front of my window was mostly asphalt driveway, so there was no evidence of someone directly or recently standing there. But the small garden directly under my window did have some footprints in it. But the tipsy adults couldn't definitively say that they weren't my parents' footprints, and there were no muddy steps outside of the garden either. The incident was again chalked up to a couple of silly kids hyped up on sugar or something like that. My best friend and I, we both remember what we saw that day, and like I said, it seared into my mind. So my grandfather, Jim, died when I was 17, around 5 years ago, and his last months were rough on the whole family. He had advanced brain cancer, but he spent most of his time at home under hospice care. One afternoon, it was about 2 weeks before he died, I was alone with my grandpa waiting for the hospice nurse to come check on him. A man who I'd never seen before, Dave, knocked on the door and he was wearing hospital scrubs, but he hadn't brought any equipment with him, which was odd. I asked him if he worked for the hospital, and he nodded. He said that this was the first shift with Jim that he'd had, but that he'd reviewed my grandfather's file, and that he wanted to speak to whichever family member had the legal authority to pull the plug. Jim wasn't even on life support, so I guess Dave was using plug as an expression of my grandfather. I should say that I live in a right-to-die state where euthanasia is legal, so it's not like that option had never occurred to us, but as far as I know, no member of my family had ever expressed an openness to euthanize Jim. I told him that I had no authority to make that decision, and that my grandfather, who was now delirious and unable to consent to much of anything, had specifically said to prolong his life indefinitely unless he was crying out in extreme pain, which he wasn't. Dave put his hand on my shoulder as though he were consoling me, and he talked about how old people become burdens, that their families need to let go of them. Then Dave pulled a bottle of pills out of his pocket and said they were barbiturates that would trigger a peaceful death. He said the coroner would determine that Jim died naturally from his cancer. At that, I started to panic, and I firmly told him that under no circumstances would he be euthanizing Jim at this time. But he started to untwist the bottle as he walked toward Jim's bed. I tried to wrestle the pills from his hand. He seemed startled. He played innocent and said that he just wanted to show the pills to Jim. Dave knew perfectly well that my grandfather had almost no idea what was going on, though. So I called 911 and rapidly explained the situation to the dispatcher. Dave suddenly became very scared and then bolted out of the house. The cops arrived within 5 minutes, and Jim's actual hospice nurse arrived a few minutes after that too. Based on my physical description, the police hospital staff were able to identify Dave as a recently fired hospital orderly. Dave was charged with making a criminal threat based on my testimony, but unfortunately, he was acquitted. So this was the creepiest and most unusual thing that has ever happened to me. And I still think about it from time to time, and I wanted to share it. So I travel pretty often for business. Usually it's San Jose, and I'll stay there for a couple of weeks. I'm usually working long hours, so by the time that I get to the hotel, I have a routine down pretty good. I get to the room late. I usually just strip down next to the bed and climb in. Maybe watch some Netflix on my tablet, and then pretty much just fall asleep. The next morning, I'll wake up, pick up my clothes and stuff them into my dirty clothes bag, hit the bathroom, then take a shower. I'll brush my teeth, comb my hair, get dressed, and leave for the day. When I pick up my clothes, I always make sure that I grab everything too. And one morning, after I had been staying at the hotel for about 10 days, I went to grab my clothes and I noticed that I only had one sock. I looked under the bed and it wasn't there. I thought that maybe I might have had it on when I got into bed, so I stripped the sheets looking for it. Not there either. I looked under every piece of furniture and just couldn't find it. I even emptied out my dirty clothes bag and counted the socks that were in there, but I still had an odd number of dirty socks. I checked the pant legs to see if it was in there, but nothing. I must have spent a good 30 minutes looking around the room for this damn sock. I even checked the garbage can. Finally, in the end, I just sort of gave up and started getting ready for work. I went into the bathroom and opened the shower to start the water running. And sitting right there in the middle of the tub was my missing sock. The shower was enclosed in glass with just a narrow gap near the ceiling about 3 inches high. I hadn't been into the bathroom since the morning before when I showered and got dressed. And to this day, I still have no idea how my sock ended up in there. I mean, it makes 0 sense. I don't know if I might have been sleepwalking, which I never do, or if a rat or something grabbed it and carried it in there, or if someone came into my room while I was sleeping and moved the sock for some reason, or if it was a ghost. I'll never know, I guess, but man, it still freaks me out to this day. And when I found that sock, I almost had a heart attack. We moved into our first home in February of 2016. It was an old home, built in the early 1900s, in the historic part of town. But I loved it. All of the hand-carved woodwork and glass doorknobs and skeleton locks. It was exactly what I wanted, and perfect for myself, 22-year-old female at the time, and my husband, 27 male at the time. I was 3 months pregnant with our first, and we were so excited to start our family. As we got settled in, we noticed the house was very noisy though. I rarely have my home quiet due to having tinnitus and always needing some kind of background noise to drown it out. On the rare occasion the house was quiet, there was always lots of creaking and moving, mostly coming from the loft-style attic that we had. We shook it off as the house just settling and being old. At least, that was what my dad told us. So we moved on. Spring came and we were scrambling to get ready for the baby. The house needed a lot of work, but we were determined to get it done. The first major encounter, though, was on a beautiful spring day. It was the weekend, and my husband and I were spending our day off working on the house. I was cleaning the kitchen, and he was working on my car in our detached garage. The way the home was sort of built is that you could see the detached garage from the window that's above the kitchen sink. I would glance out every now and then to see what he was up to. A little time passed, and I hadn't looked out at him for a bit. I started doing the dishes when I heard him walking into the living room towards the kitchen. I could feel his presence, and without turning my back, I said, "Hey, babe." But there was no answer. Wondering why he didn't answer, I looked back over my shoulder, only to be met with a dark silhouette of a man standing between the living room and the kitchen. In the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. Unsure of what I had just seen, I yelled through the window for my husband, who was still in the garage. He came in frantically, and I told him someone was in the house. Immediately, he went and grabbed his weapon and checked all over the house, but there was nothing there. In all of the years we lived in that house, too, not once did my husband see our roommate. I saw him all the time, out of the corner of my eye, peeking around the corners, but more than anything, I saw him looking into the living room from the staircase that led to the attic. In the beginning, he frightened me, but after a while, I don't know, I sort of got used to him being there. I even spoke to him sometimes, telling him that I'm okay if he stays in the attic, and asked him to leave my baby alone. He must have agreed, since in the 5 years my son lived there, he never saw him. When we went to sell our home, the realtor brought up some historical information that she found regarding the house and our neighborhood too. And we found out that our house and our neighbor's house was built by a brother and sister. Our home was the brothers. Their last name was the same as our current neighbor, so I figured that he was most likely a descendant. And I asked him one day, and he told me that the sister was his mum and his uncle owned our home. He said that he was a kind man who lived alone and died in the home many years ago. I asked him about the attic, and he said that that was his uncle's favorite place in the home. He kept all of his trinkets and projects up there, and he would spend hours working on things. I didn't tell him that I believed my house was haunted, as he didn't seem like the type who would believe me, but our home was listed and sold within the same day. And sometimes I wonder about the man in the attic, if the new owners are nice to him or have even noticed his presence. I hope that they'll give him his space, as they're only passerbys in his home like we once were, I guess, but in any case, I know it's a somewhat good ending, but it was definitely a creepy experience, and I've never seen or heard anything like it since. It was only in this house that I saw the Shadow Man. This takes place about 7 years ago when I was 17. For context, I'm a pretty small and weak girl who only lives with my brother. My parents live in a different state. Also, please note too that I won't be using anyone's real name. So, it was winter time, the last period before lunch break, and I was looking forward to going out with my friends, since my high school allows us to leave the campus for lunch. Me and my two girlfriends, we got together and walked to the nearby shopping plaza and looked around. I wasn't really hungry, so I just sort of was looking around to see if I recognized anyone from school around here. And that's when I saw a man in a black hoodie leaning on some old beaten-up pickup. I wasn't too surprised to see him, since this is public property, but I was a little confused that he was staring right at us. But that was when it clicked into my head that he sees us, 3 teenage girls looking lost. He's probably going to make a move on us, or maybe he's going to try and, kidnap us or something. Then, to my shock, he actually began to approach us. At this point, I was starting to have thoughts of being abducted and ending up becoming a missing person who probably is going to be found dead years later or something. I happen to think of the worst things when I get anxious. I know it's unrealistic, but I quickly turned to my friends and tried to throw out ideas of where to go, but I didn't want to show them that I was freaking out. When suddenly I heard my name. Sarah? Hey, Sarah. It's Dan. Your brother Josh asked me to find you. The voice sounds rather nice, but when I turned around, it was the same man. I felt like I was shot in the stomach because I stared at him for a few seconds before quickly breaking eye contact and looking around. Oh, who are you? I asked nervously. Well, I'm Dan, a longtime buddy of Josh. We actually went to that same high school together. So far, no lies were told. My brother did in fact go to this high school, and this guy did look about the same age as him. Hey, listen, your brother asked me to take you home. He mentioned something about meds. Somehow or another, he seemed to know the truth. You see, I sometimes have to take certain medication for my stomach issues, so far this Dan person was rather, honest, I thought. Or somehow knew stuff about me. Yeah, he said that he's piled in paperwork at the office and wants me to take you back to the office so you can stay with him till he's able to take you home. At this point, logically, I felt like this was a pretty trustworthy guy, but my gut was turning so much that I actually felt like I could be sick. I haven't noticed before, but my two friends decided to leave me. Jerks, right? I knew that I didn't really have much of a choice, I guess. I mean, I could tell him no, but what if he's telling the truth and my brother gets mad at me for not going with him? I know, I was young and stupid. And sure, I had a phone, but my brother turns his phone off at work. Or maybe if I tried to run and he grabs me, this might make a whole scene, which I honestly hate doing. So the only option that I really had, well, I thought so at that age, was just to go with him. So I took a light breath and accepted to just go with him. I got into the passenger seat and noticed that the car was kept rather clean, but the windows seemed almost like they were tinted from the inside. Dan turned his car on, which gave off a really nasty old car struggling sort of sound before turning on, and drove off. While on this ride, I kept my eyes down, not trying to look around or accidentally look at Dan again, but I did notice him eating some potato chips from a bag sitting on the center console. He would grab one at a time and go back for more frequently, but that's when he just grabbed my thigh out of nowhere and held it for a second. To make this worse, I was wearing some fairly short shorts because I can usually take the cold weather, so my upper thigh was visible while sitting. I stared at his hand for a second, feeling my head beating faster before he let go. "Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. I often keep my chips on the passenger seat," he explained. But I didn't say anything. I just went back to staring at my phone, not even fake texting. I was too scared to look at him. After maybe 10 minutes of driving, I finally looked up, seeing an unfamiliar road before he pulled up onto a trailer park. "I hope you don't mind. I just got to grab something before going to your bros. Come on inside. It gets really cold out here." No thank you. I'll be fine here. I actually need your help too, so come on in." He didn't look it, but his voice was almost demanding. I really didn't want to get on his bad side, so I agreed and quickly got out of the truck and followed. He led me to his trailer as I really didn't want to go in, and he started to take off his jacket. He then grabbed mine, which shocked me. "It's okay, the Hester can get real hot in here." He then grabbed the sweater that I was wearing, but also my shirt under, and pulled up, forcing now all of my layers up. This pinned my arms up, blinding me, and I panicked and tried to struggle, but he held my shirt up. He said, "I see your tummy." I then felt as if I knew my innocence was about to be gone this day. But the weirdest thing happened. He poked my belly button and swelled his finger in it, which at first didn't hurt, but he kept pushing harder and harder, pushing my back to the cold wall, and just kept going. It was horrible, and just having my belly button pushed in deeper and deeper like that, and it really hurt. I felt like I was about to be sick the amount of pressure that he was putting on it, but then suddenly he just stopped and released my shirt. As quickly as I could, I pulled my shirt and then sweater down, panicking as my heart was racing. He was laughing and patting the wall as if he had just heard the funniest joke. I felt sick, so I rushed out as fast as I could and coughed up just a few feet from his front door. Dan rushed out and tried to explain himself, but I jumped away as fast as I could. Breathlessly, I just said, I can't, or something like that. Maybe I'm sorry, I can't, and I just begged as I fled the scene. I was thankfully able to run far enough to get to another neighborhood while I called one of my friends to pick me up after giving her the streets that I was on. And this whole situation felt like the entire day, but actually probably only lasted maybe like 20 minutes. I did speak to my brother about this, and he in fact did send Dan to get me. I never told him about what happened, and I fear my brother might take Dan's side if I did, but all that matters is that in the end I was okay and able to escape something that definitely could have gone a whole lot worse. So I'm an adult now, and this almost happened many years ago when I was around 11 to 13, I believe. This most likely happened in the year of 2013, if my memory serves me correct. My brother was the same age too, because we're twins, and my family was on a vacation at Galveston, Texas for a few days. This incident happened on the last day of our trip. We had fun at a pleasure pier which had plenty of rides, and afterwards we went to the beach for a few hours. Our parents decided that they wanted to go back to the car early, but we wanted to stay a little longer to collect seashells and swim and stuff like that. Once we got tired of the beach, we walked up the steps which led to the sidewalk where the cars were parked. My parents parked their car nearby, but it wasn't close enough to where they could see us walk up. Me and my brother knew exactly where to go though, so right when we reached the top of the stairs, two adult men started talking to us, saying something along the lines of, "Hey, we're having a big party, would you guys like to come?" They spoke vaguely about what the party would be like and that they had drinks there. They clearly tried to convince us to say yes though, and I instantly felt suspicious of them because they looked to be around their maybe mid-20s or early 30s. Why would they ask us when we were obviously kids and we just got back from the beach? I asked them when the party was and they told me that it was later tonight. However, they said that it would be cool if we wanted to hang out with them now instead. I assumed that they meant by going in their car with them for a ride or something. I thought that their car could possibly be nearby. I told them that we can't because our parents are waiting for us. Thankfully, that made them back off and they quickly just sort of ran away, and after that we never saw them again. As soon as we got in the car, I wanted to tell my parents about what happened, and they thought it was weird too. I'm glad that I was with my brother in that moment too, because I don't know how he would have reacted or what these guys would have said if he wasn't. I don't remember him saying anything to them in that moment, but in a way I feel like I protected him by speaking up and saying no as well. Now, I'm sure those guys watched us for some time, so they could make sure our parents weren't around before speaking to us. When we saw them, they faced towards the ocean, unlike other people who would just walk past us. I'm also curious if anyone else experienced a similar kind of, I don't know, I want to say trafficking tactic, or perhaps heard about something like this from someone else. So, before I tell my story, you guys probably need to know some key information that will be shown in about 20 seconds. So I and my brother and girlfriend all play airsoft on the weekend, and I sleep naked. I was home alone as my mother was at her parents' house for the night, and so I was 14 at the time and I was living in a weird and not so good neighborhood. But it wasn't too bad. I mean, it's not the type of people who would murder you or anything, but the type of people where you'd have to check everywhere locked twice to feel like you're safe. Luckily for me, when I came back from airsoft with my brother and girlfriend, I locked the doors and window, but I forgot that I had burnt something in the oven earlier and I had to keep one of the kitchen windows open. I live only with my mum and my German Shepherd, who is an actual monster. But at around 3 in the morning, I heard my dog bark viciously near my kitchen window, and what I've known over the years is that if my dog is barking that viciously, I knew something was up. So I put on some underwear and I got my gun off the wall and walked into the kitchen and turned on the light to find that there was a man wearing black clothes and night vision goggles on, and they were still on, blaring a green light glowing at the ceiling, and he was half in and half out of my kitchen window, wiggling like a worm. It's a tough window to get into, but the window was about eye level, and I cocked the gun back, ready to fire, and said, "Get out of my house." He stared at me, completely confounded, considering that he'd just been caught by a 14-year-old boy wearing just underwear and aiming a rifle towards him. He looked panicked, though, at the fact that the rifle was aimed straight at him, and he quickly rolled out of my window and ran into the nearby woods. I called the police and reported the guy with every detail that I saw on the man. A week later, a girl went missing. She was home alone and there was no sign of forced entry. The man had been caught for some really vile stuff just 2 streets away, and in his police interrogation, he confessed about stalking children by watching their houses at night. He used night vision goggles with green lights in it. You can probably imagine my shock. I would just like to remind people too to keep your eyes on the lookout for people like this, and always keep every door and window closed and locked. Not what I did. So me and my best friend or roommate have been living together about 3 years now. But this is kind of important too because we're so familiar with each other at this point. But we have a beautiful historic home in the city, but with the rent skyrocketing and 4 dogs to clean up after, spending $2,000 a month for a massive 8-bedroom home is just simply not worth the cost anymore. So we decided to downsize and stop renting. But we're moving into a new house that is in need of a lot of TLC to make it livable. But it was a great deal and will save me hours of my time in cleaning and cost $3K less a month in bills for both of us. It's really such a good opportunity, but unfortunately the house, while new and quite nice, has been through a rat infestation and was kind of a hoard site. You see, the prior resident kept her stuff at the house, but had mostly abandoned it and hadn't even slept there in about maybe 4 years. She chain smoked inside every day when she was there, and I don't know that it was ever cleaned or anything too, so we're definitely in the thick of it right now, getting it back into shape. Clearing furniture and tidying, repainting and power washing. Outside of changing light fixtures and appliances, repairing flooring and stuff like that, we aren't doing a lot of major construction. Just sort of, I guess, sanitizing, I guess you could say, and redecorating, basically. We know the prior residents well, though, as we bought the house from his family, and it definitely seems like the house got how it was due to undiagnosed depression. Well, currently my roommate is visiting this long-distance boyfriend in NOLA, and I've been focusing on clearing out and repainting the sunroom, and I'm almost exclusively there at night, but a couple of nights ago I was doing that with the backsliding door open to the backyard, and I heard my roommate's voice. Not any voice, but his voice. I could identify it too in my sleep. I mean, we're together so much. I couldn't tell what he said at all, but it was exactly his voice and sounded like a casual conversation, like he was talking to me from out of the yard. But I knew that he wasn't even in the state. Despite that, I really didn't feel scared or any bad vibes, I guess. I just sort of slid the door closed and kept working. Nothing else weird happened, and I moved on, but I kept thinking about it. Without bringing this up, I asked him if anything weird had happened to him in the house, and he told me that years ago, while staying there, he was sure that he saw a man in the backyard and called the police. We live in a high-crime city, so that's really not that unusual, but he said the police found no evidence of anyone on the property, and that sometimes when he stayed over there, he would hear weird sounds, but nothing that really alarmed him. That's when I told him that I heard this voice in the backyard, and now I guess we're just kind of curious. I literally feel no negativity and bad vibes or danger on that property, but maybe I feel like I should. A close friend recommended that I place railroad spikes at the four corners of the property and iron nails above the exterior doors that lead into the home. I don't know if I believe in that or even what it's supposed to do exactly, but if anyone else has any advice, similar experiences, or ideas about what I should do about all this, I would love some additional input. Like I said, I definitely heard my roommate's voice, no doubt about it, and he wasn't even in the state. So I have this friend who's into, like, spiritual stuff, meditates a lot, makes more cleaning rituals, etc. I'm definitely more like a skeptic person, always trying to find a logical reason for weird stuff. But this was all challenged, though, when I visited my friend last year in November. We wanted to go for a walk in the evening, like we often do, and I sensed that something was just off with him. When I asked him, he told me that there's something in this apartment, something weird. Long story short, I wanted to go and take a look, so we went into his apartment, and as soon as we were in there, it didn't really feel that welcoming as it normally did. His cat came sprinting to him as soon as we entered, and she acted a little bit stressed, I guess you could say. He told me that he saw something standing in his living room at night when he went to go to the toilet, but whenever he looked and turned all the lights on, there would be nothing there. I felt really uneasy while he told me this, and I was just looking around, because it really felt like someone was watching me. After a while, I asked him if we could leave. He agreed, and I walked to his apartment door, and he then went into his bedroom, which is on the other side of the living room, and the door to the apartment, because he was looking for his cat to maybe come with us. I told him that I'll be waiting outside, and as I said that, I left the apartment, door wide open, and As soon as I was out in the hall, the door just suddenly slammed shut with a huge bang. My friend come rushing out, pale as flour, and his cat didn't even hesitate to just jump down the stairs and sprint to the main door of the house. I just sort of stood there, shocked. My friend leaned against the wall, saying nothing at all. He stayed the night at his mother's house with his cat that night. And of course, we talked about this later. I tried to find a logical way to explain what had happened, but there's no window open in his apartment, and the door in the main hall of the house was closed too. And the door is a massive old wooden door as well, which is a little bit hard to open and close even. To this day, both of us don't know what the cause of this was, but after this evening, the weird stuff that happened, it just never occurred again. I have no idea what happened that day, but I will never, as long as I live, forget that door slamming in my face with absolutely no reason for it to do so. So I was walking down the trail that exists outside the subdivision that I used to live on. It was broad daylight, and it was a road that cars frequently drove down 10 feet off of the trail. But there was a thicket between the trail and the road that would have obscured the vision of drivers passing by. As I'm walking down the path nearing the entrance to my subdivision, I encounter a woman standing in the middle of the path. She says that her phone died, or some such excuse, I don't remember exactly, and asked me if I could let her use my phone to call someone. Now, I had read some stories here by this point, and even though I was a 5'10" dude and around 250 pounds, while she was probably like 5'6" at best and half my weight, I was immediately suspicious and a little bit fearful. I did, however, give her my phone. I probably shouldn't have, but it's very hard to decline a simple request for help like that when you're just put on the spot. Still, I was wary and on high alert. And well, my fears were immediately realized as, in the next moment, I hear the sound of movement in the thicket. I immediately whipped around and see this man emerging from the thicket who is even smaller than this woman. He doesn't say a word to me and doesn't even really react to my whipping around and noticing his presence. He just walks up to the woman's side. I didn't notice much reaction from her end on this too. They clearly knew each other, and stood there until she held my phone back out to me, the call having been unsuccessful. I grabbed my phone, turned around, and I walked away. Now, there are two explanations that I can think of as to what happened here. One is that it was very much a classic setup. The guy thought better of it and bailed on that plan, whether on account of the size difference or because I was visibly on edge and anticipating something. I do think that this is probably what happened, but it's odd to me that he never seemed to react much to me turning around and seeing him. If he had been creeping up on me and inadvertently made too much noise, I would not have expected him to keep on casually just strolling over as if nothing had happened. I guess it's also possible that he just decided against using me as a mark and emerged from his hiding spot without a care in the world because he'd already decided that it was a bust. Or two, this guy just happened to leave his girlfriend or wife or whatever's side to cross through the thicket and out towards the road for whatever reason, and just so happened to return to her at that time. But I have a hard time believing this one because it just doesn't make any sense for him to be on the opposite side of that thicket where the road was, unless he was like waving cars down for help or something. But it's not like that thicket totally blocked my vision of the road, and I had a lot of time spent approaching the woman once she had entered my line of sight before I had actually crossed her on the trail. Plenty of time to notice someone mucking around on the opposite side of the thicket. Add on to that the fact that she made no mention of this guy prior, and I don't find this explanation too likely. Which means that I was probably almost set up for something horrible. Back in 2019, my girlfriend and I went on a vacation in Ponza, an island in Italy. Everything went well, except that the last day, we would have gone back home the morning after. It rained a bit. It didn't rain a lot. The streets were pretty dry, but the sky was grey, and we came back into our little house at like 5 p.m. because of the bad weather. We got bored quickly, and we had to wait at least 3 or 4 hours before we could go in to eat at the restaurant, so I decided to visit the only part of the island that I hadn't seen. We got on my motorbike and went to Calafonte, which I found out was totally abandoned due to a collapse that happened in 2017. The whole neighborhood was as neglected and deserted as the beach and the restaurants were, and I swear, too, that we passed through every house, road, or parking lot, and it was just a desert. Nobody lived there, not even a tourist or a car. I think that the collapse of the beach made that spot less interesting, I guess. Anyway, I kept driving in that neighborhood until I ended up in a road and street near a football field. And when we got there were 2 kids playing football on the end of the street. We also noticed that every house nearby was shut closed, not a sign of a human being for like kilometers. So where did these 2 come from? Well, we got close. My girlfriend and I were already freaked out, but I wanted to talk to them because, if I remember correctly, I was looking for a place that I couldn't find, and I thought that maybe they knew where it was. So we approached them. They must have been no more than 6 or 7 years old, dirty as anything, like coal mine dirty. One kid had sort of like a white or more like grey, dirty and torn t-shirt, and the other had only like this rag-like pants. Both of them had no shoes on, and their hair was completely shaved. The shirtless kid had a sort of circular wound, more like a hole in the middle of his pectorals. It was red, bloody, and new, like he'd just been shot or stabbed or something in the middle of his chest. Anyway, I asked this kid if he was okay and also where this place was, and they answered me, but I just couldn't understand a thing that they were saying. It wasn't like the local dialect or an Italian dialect at all. It was just like incomprehensible gibberish. They kept talking and pointing at my bike, but we couldn't understand a thing though, so in the end we just said goodbye and made a U-turn. I could see them staring at us from my mirrors. Man, we were freaked out. Anyway, as we kept driving, I looked in the mirror again, but when I did, they were gone. Now, there was just absolutely no way that these kids could have disappeared like that. There was nowhere for them to go, but not that quickly anyway. In the end, we just got out of there, and I can't confirm 100% for certain if it was a proper paranormal encounter or maybe it was just the 2 kids ducked down or something somewhere, but it was a really weird experience and something that I just cannot explain. So for context, I lived on a ranch in rural South Texas. My house was built in a sort of square shape with 2 living rooms, and all of the bedrooms and hallways connect via bathrooms, so you could walk around the whole house without hitting a dead end. And as a kid, I would sleep in my parents' room, which connected to the back living room or game room. My parents' bed faces the door leading out said room, and one night during a bad thunderstorm, the power went out, and I couldn't sleep, and eventually a flashlight beam appeared on the wall straight across from the doorway, and out of shock, I sort of sat up and stared at it for what I felt like was an eternity. Not knowing where this light was coming from, after maybe 2 or so minutes, I started to see someone sort of stick their hands in front of the beam and started to do hand puppets of a bird and then a dog and then a few more creatures, which I can't explain, but they were at that point that you would make those figures with your fingers. I watched in amazement for a few minutes, but began to realize that both of my parents were laying next to me and we should have been the only ones in the house. My first instinct was that it was someone outside on the back porch doing this through the glass door, but then I noticed that it couldn't have been due to the angle that they would have had to have been next to the door, or way along the wall, which was impossible. I woke my mother up to look, but she didn't want to budge and told me to go to sleep. At the same time, the hand puppets became more erratic and were sort of shifting, so to speak, faster and faster, and I started to cry, and my mother woke up and looked at me, and how I was acting, she eventually looked at the doorway, but said that she saw nothing. I looked back in the direction, and it was gone. Now, I know that this is a really strange story, but after this night, every now and then, at night, the flashlight and the puppets would come back, and I tried to show my parents, but they would never wake up and catch it on time. I would just cover my head with the blankets and hold onto my mother's arm for dear life. As an adult, I can still see the memory of it clear as day, but the thing that gets me the most is that the wall that I could see these puppet shows on had some, Coca-Cola collectibles on it, and one of them was glowing in the dark, and then the shadow of the puppets would sort of cross over it. It would go completely black, as if it never had any light. It was just as dark as everything else. And when it was over, it was back to normal. There have been plenty more things that have happened to my parents' ranch, and if anyone's interested, I would be willing to tell more of those stories, but this one has always stuck out to me because it was just so weird. So I've worked as a correctional officer for a long time now. I've worked at facilities in Texas and in Michigan. The oldest prison that I ever worked at just recently started to close in Michigan, and it got me thinking about all of the paranormal experiences that I've had there, and in the other prisons that I've worked at as well. I'd like to share with all of you some of the more notable paranormal experiences that I've had while working in these prisons. But first off, I'd like to say that I never really believed in ghosts, I guess, before I started working as a correctional officer, that is. I started off working in Texas at an intake facility. I worked night shifts, 12 hours from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. The first experience that I ever had was working on a lower security housing unit. When finishing a round, I was chatting with my partner and I heard a loud banging sound. It was at 3 in the morning at this point, so no prisoners should be out of their bunks. I asked my partner if they knew what the banging was, and they, being an older officer, told me bluntly that the unit that we were working in was haunted. They told me the sound was coming from a door of one of the small quiet cells in a hallway not directly visible from the officer station, and about how a prisoner had died in one. The prisoner allegedly died because the officers working there at the time had given them a sack of food when it was lunchtime for prisoners, and the prisoner had actually choked on the food and died. To be honest, I really didn't believe that the unit was haunted, so I decided to go look at this door. The sound volume increased as I got closer to it, and when I could see it, the door itself was visibly shaking as if someone was pounding on it. But there was nothing that could have been causing the door to shake like that. I was at a loss for words, and later that night I checked the door again, and there was a steamed-up handprint visible on the glass of the door's window. It was a really weird experience, and it was definitely something that was, unexplainable. Anyway, another experience that I had was at the same facility, but at a different housing unit. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I was sitting inside the officer station watching the cameras and talking to my partner. I look at one of the cameras and clearly see a prisoner sitting at the table in the day room. I turn my head to look at the day room, and there's no one sitting at the table that I just saw on the camera. I asked my partner to go and check it out because no one is supposed to be out of bed yet. I roll back the time on the camera to see if I could see where the prisoner might have gone. The prisoner on the camera literally just slowly fades away and vanishes completely. My partner comes back into the officer station, and we both watch this video over and over, being just dumbstruck as to what we are seeing. Later on that same night, during one of my rounds, I notice a wet floor sign that got left out. I return it to the porter closet. I get back to the officer station and look back to where the porter closet is, and I'll be damned, I see the same wet floor sign left out. I obviously asked my partner if they were playing a joke on me or something because I just put the sign away, but my partner denies doing anything with it. I go back out and make sure that I put the sign back in the closet and lock the door this time. I get back to the officer station, a wet floor sign right there in the open again. My partner and I are both watching this wet floor sign now, and it starts to tip over on one end really slowly, 2 of its legs off the ground. The sign then slams itself to the ground, and then proceeded to slide back up the hallway and then back to the front of the closet door before ceasing all movement. My partner and I We refused to come out of the officer station for the rest of the night that night because we were just terrified. One more notable one from Texas as well. I was working in an ad seg unit, really high security unit for prisoners that get in fights and cause a lot of problems repeatedly. We had a prisoner who was sitting in one of the closed observation cells. These cells are usually used for people who threaten harming themselves. In the summertime, prisoners will sometimes just say that they're suicidal to be put in one of these cells because they're a lot cooler and are near AC vents that the normal housing units don't have. And the prisoners told me that this was what they were doing and that they didn't want to cause any problems. Later on that night, one of my partners and I were watching cameras and all of a sudden we see a shadow moving across the floor. Eventually it comes to the close observation cell and disappears under the door. This is where it gets a little crazy too. You see, I do a round and check on the close observation cell. The prisoner is pacing in the cell and I ask them if they're okay, and the prisoner tells me that something just doesn't feel right and that they're hearing voices that aren't there. I try to calm them down and eventually they do and lay on the bed. Later on, my partner calls for assistance because the prisoner had apparently tried to end it. But the weirdest thing is that apparently they were holding their wrists above their head and allegedly were speaking in tongues. Now, I wasn't there for that one, but with everything else that I'd seen in this place, and also knowing my partner the way that I did, I believe it. So, when I started working at prisons in Michigan, I worked at a prison that was now closing. It was built back in 1877 and is one of the oldest prisons still operating in all of the United States. But there were so many small experiences that I'd had there that it would be too long to get into. But like doors would slam, you would hear voices, cold chills, all that stuff. But the first really notable experience that I had was around Christmas time on the third shift. I was working in the oldest unit on the facility. Usually we don't have prisoners there, but we had opened the unit to separate prisoners during the COVID pandemic and whatnot. I didn't have a partner due to how short-staffed we were, so one of the other officers set up a TV for me to keep me entertained because I'd be really far away from all the other units and get bored with no one to talk to. I do rounds for most of the night watching TV in between them, when I suddenly hear a banging noise from a door that leads to a hallway that takes you all the way to an even older unused condemned part of the prison. I open the door, take a look down the hallway, and a cold breeze hits me, and suddenly my arm hairs just are standing all on end. I close the door, thoroughly creeped out. I go and sit down and start watching TV again, but the TV starts flipping through channels rapidly, and then stops on static. I have to get moved to a different unit because, to be honest, I was pretty terrified again. One day on the third shift, my work friend and I were working positions that allowed us to have a lot of free time and no prisoners to watch, when we decided to explore the prison. We explored the tunnels that went underneath the prison, the old barns, the old unstaffed gun towers, and we eventually decided to go look at the old condemned part of the prison from my earlier experience. There was a big metal gate that was about maybe halfway down the hallway that had to be opened by a big skeleton key. We get back to the old condemned part, and my friend tells me about how this part was supposed to be the old segregation. We had to use flashlights to see because this section is so old that it's not powered. But the energy back there, I will never forget. Just being there filled me with a feeling of just utter dread. I asked my friend to head back, and we start to head back down to where the hallway to the gate was, when my friend's flashlight suddenly dies. When we make it back to the hallway, barely able to see anything in the almost pitch blackness, when we hear something running after us. So we start running up the hallway too. My friend fumbles with the key as we hear it getting closer. We get the gate open and sprint out of there. And later on, I noticed that my friend had red claw marks all over his arms. It was a crazy and truly scary experience, and it was something that I hope to never, ever experience again. This is something that happened years ago, but the thought of it still keeps me up at night. I was walking through the hills of a provincial park with my dog during the winter, so the sun set much faster than I expected, and before I could get back to my car, it was already dark. Once the sun was gone and all you could see was darkness, I was walking slowly through a field when out of nowhere I had, to this day, the most gut-wrenching, undeniable feeling that I was being watched. I turned around and in the distance I saw a figure standing there, darker than the night sky around us. The instant that I saw him, my stomach dropped and my body literally froze. I knew in that moment somehow that he was coming for me. I grabbed my dog's leash and we booked it. Sprinting full speed up and down the hills, around the trees, down embankments. I was running so fast as if my life was dependent on it. And to this day, I'm pretty sure that it was. I make the 30 to 45 minute trip in 10, and all that stands before me in my car is this switchback. You have to sort of go back and forth up if you want to reach the top. So once again, I'm giving it all I got, running up this switchback as fast as I possibly can. And once I reach the top and look back down, who else but this person is chasing me? And he gets up the switchback like how any sane person would. Of course not. He starts sprinting right up the middle of this switchback, heading straight for me. I scream at him to leave me alone, and he doesn't say anything. Not a single word, just continues running right at me. I am so lucky that my car was at the top of this hill, because as I ran towards it, just like in the horror movies, I dropped my keys and I was fiddling with them trying to open the door. Just in time too, I get the door open, throw my dog in it, and shut the door behind me just as this guy reaches us. The best part is that there were no other vehicles parked anywhere around us, but where did this person park? Yeah, right next to me of all places. Now, this guy literally jumps into his truck so quickly, and to this day I've never seen a better example of speeds out of there like a bat out of hell. He guns the engine so hard, black smoke is blasting out of the back as he swerves out of there, leaving skid marks behind him. I sat in the back of my vehicle for hours afterwards, shaking and crying, knowing that I was this close to whatever he had planned for me. And that's why I'm sharing this story, in the hopes that people won't ignore that gut feeling, the little voice in the back of your head that tells you to run. If I didn't that day, I never would have noticed him in time and would have had the heads... If I didn't that day, I never would have noticed him in time and wouldn't have had the head start that I needed to escape. Always trust your gut feelings and intuitions, because it might really be the deciding factor in if this is your final day on Earth or not. This all happened about a decade ago at a travel center in New Mexico. I worked the night shift as a prep cook there, and while there I had a few strange experiences that I'd like to share with you. So, the first was pretty standard. I was chopping onions, and out of the corner of my eye I see a figure walk past me and stop in the corner. When I turned to look, nobody was there, and I felt the base of my spine go ice cold. Now, to clarify, my family has history with, paranormal stuff. Had a great-grandma who was a medium. I used to see shadow figures all the time in my childhood home until I was 15 or so, and then started seeing them again when I was in a deep depression with tendencies, much better now, in my early 20s. That chill down my spine always accompanied these experiences though, and I use it as a bit of an indicator that something is near. Anyway, after that first experience, I started to ask around, and this was a common occurrence here. In fact, 3 or 4 people had the exact same thing happen. Busy with a task, a dark figure at the edge of their vision walks by. When they turn to look, it's gone. It would happen again occasionally, but I would just ignore it. The second wasn't a single incident, but something that happened regularly, usually after seeing it in the corner of my eye again. Part of my job as a prep cook was making large batches of soup and chilies for the next day. I'd put these 5-gallon pots on the burners with the meat to start browning, turn to chop the veggies, and when I turned back, all my burners would be off. Fairly innocuous, but it happened too often for it to be an error, and again it was accompanied by a chill in my spine. But the final incident actually happened to someone else, but I was present for it. To explain as well, here is a quick rundown of how our walk-in is laid out. So, the door was in the prep kitchen. Inside the walk-in was a second door that led to our freezer. The freezer had its own light switch that was located in the regular walk-in fridge. So, the line cook goes into the walk-in. I think nothing of it until he comes out a few minutes later wanting to kick my butt. After I calm him down, he tells me that he was in the freezer section when all of a sudden the lights turn out and he starts hearing a man laughing coming from the main walk-in. I let him know that not only was it not me, but I'd been in the kitchen the whole time and nobody else had gone in. He goes white as a sheet at this and didn't want to talk about it anymore. So, those are my experiences at the truck stop. Thankfully, I don't have much contact with the other side now that I'm in a better headspace, but I have a couple of others from my time in New Mexico that I might share at some point in the future. For now, it feels good to get this off my chest, and I just want to say thanks for listening. So first off, just let me say that it doesn't really bother me if you believe me or not. I just want to share this for people who might be interested. That said, I had my second hypno-regression session today to revisit my alien abduction when I was 6. I remember everything. I thought that I had a clear picture last time, but I was wrong. The second session had me face the entire thing without fear, and I remember them taking me, their megaship, their transport hangar, all of the human-looking people, crafts, the bed, the tracker, the box. I remember it all. So, I was 6 years old, and this took place sometime between 2001 and 2002 in Washington State, USA. I remember seeing a blinding, bright white light fill my entire room and illuminate everything in it. Then I remember seeing these two people appear out of nowhere, standing in my room next to my window, and I hear a resounding voice in my head say, "Come with us." Next thing I know, I remember floating up through the roof of my house, seeing the entire city below. The feeling of weightlessness, bliss, confusion, fear, and excitement. I'll never forget it, all at the same time. I remember going into this large white room, the bright lights and small silver orb crafts with small sort of looking fins around the bottom sides lining the wall. Maybe 5 or 6 of them. At this point, I remember running out of there and going into a hallway, frantically pushing past what I assumed to be other grown-ups. I remember hearing them gasp in surprise as I pushed past them, and that's when I remember running up to this large window. I looked out, trying to get a sense of where I was, and all I saw was space and the earth below me. I remember being scared, running away and into another group of these people where one stood up and said, "Whoa, you're not supposed to be up here." They grabbed me, soothed me with this weird sort of sensation of being under a waterfall of smoke that tingles the entire body as it washes over you. They said that their name was Arik and held me there until 2 smaller people showed up. At this point, I think they did something to me because I couldn't move. I remember being floated or carried back down this hallway and into this large room with a strange brown light that glowed in the whole room. They laid me down into a bed, and that's where this large mantis-like being was there, wearing some kind of a robe or a coat. I know it sounds really weird, but I remember being scared, a bit somehow okay with it, but I had this warm, sort of hazy feeling still. I remember being held down by my hands and wrists, and it hurt a lot. The mantid told me that it was so that I wouldn't run away, but that they'll help take the pain away, and they did. I distinctly remember the pain went away after that. Next, I remember it turned on a bright overhead light in the room, turned my head to the left and put a large sort of cylindrical needle or syringe thing behind my right ear, and then everything just went completely white and fuzzy. They said that it was a tracker, and it was so that they could watch me. They told me that it was all part of the plan so that they could study and preserve humans for the future. They told me that I'm supposed to be a teacher and that my purpose is in the future of this world. Next, I remember being taken by these 2 smaller beings into an adjacent room, where they gave me this, small box. When I opened it, it exploded in a fountain of light, and inside the light, I saw screens with pictures of trees, mountains, a river, memories, numbers, letters, people walking, symbols, and all kinds of things. But most of all, it showed me my previous life. And to be honest, I really don't know what to think of this. So, I would really like some help. In this box, this previous life, these beings showed me the house I lived at, how I lost my family of a wife and 2 kids, and how it ultimately led to my all-consuming sorrow and the taking of my own life. If anyone knows a Marcus Peterson who had a wife and 2 kids that were about 10 and 6, give or take a few years, died in a car accident, and Mark took his own life. We lived in a small house on a piece of land surrounded by trees, apparently, with a front porch covered by a small roof, a screen door, and brown wooden front door. Then please, do let me know. In any case, after that whole experience, they took me back to this large hangar area. They floated me back down into my room with the bright light, laid me down into my bed, turned around, and I felt them say, "We'll be seeing you again soon." And then they left. And that's pretty much it. So if you have any ideas as to what I should do now, then I would love to hear it. A few weeks ago, me, 23-year-old female, and a friend, 24-year-old female, planned to go to an event together. Since we only had free time after work, we decided to get an Uber so we wouldn't take too long to arrive and could enjoy more. But the first half of the ride was really normal, seemed like a normal, polite dude. But as soon as we got to the highway, his attitude changed. He seemed a lot more irritated. Me and my friend didn't pay much attention though and kept chatting between us. Our attention was drawn when he started shouting with another driver. He turned to us and said that he was going to pull over. I tried objecting, but he ignored and pulled over anyway. He reached out for the glove compartment and pulled a gun out. Important to note that guns are illegal in my country too. We were just watching this unfold with holded breath, and when the other guy drove away, we let out a sigh of relief, but then we were still stuck in the car with this crazy guy with a gun. After that, he went back to driving and apologized to us, saying that the guy was tailgating him. I let out an, okay, I got it. He kept talking. Man, that guy's lucky that you 2 girls are here, or else I would have followed him and shot him in the face. Sleazy idiot. I look over to my friend. She is in shock and paralyzed. I'm in shock too, but trying to keep my cool because the last thing that I want is to get this guy annoyed at us. I mean, if he was willing to shoot that guy for tailgating, I didn't want to know what he would do to us if I said the wrong thing. No, it's okay, I understand, I say, trying to appease him. These guys need to be taught a lesson, he continued while I just agreed with my head. I did that before, you know. You just trap the guy in an empty street and when he leaves the car, bang. Did he just admit to murder? Was the only thing running through my mind. But somehow I managed to keep calm and just agreed with him the rest of the way. He did deliver us to the right place with no more incidences. I waited a few weeks to report this since he had my home address and wouldn't be hard to figure out who reported him. Thankfully, nobody showed up at my home with a gun, at least until now, and Uber has answered my report saying that they started an investigation. I hope that this guy doesn't do this to anyone else because it was a truly terrifying experience, to say the least. This happened a few years back, and though I've experienced other strange phenomena since, this in particular has always stuck in my brain. So I worked as a server at what was portrayed to be a high-class evening restaurant where a reservation was required. The restaurant was inside a pre-Civil War era stone house and located right in the center of a well-known haunted town with a lot of history. It was around 4:50 p.m., 10 minutes before opening. I was the only one on the schedule that night besides for the chef. The dining room had large street-facing windows that had been sealed shut for years with no other opening to the outside. Everything was set up for the night, and all I had left to do was lighting the 15 or so candles that decorated the mantel and the tables. The candles had no trouble sparking up and had steady, consistent flames. Before exiting from the dining room, I took a last remaining glimpse to ensure perfection and was very happy with my work. I then left for the kitchen to quickly check in with the chef before opening. I made my way back to the dining room after no more than maybe a minute, and And when I say that I was absolutely gobstruck, I'm not kidding, because every single candle had been blown out. And there was still smoke lingering from all 15 candles as well. And my mind just cannot come up with an explanation, a logical one anyway, for this. I mean, there was no possible entrance in the dining room besides the front door, which had been firmly locked. The chef and I were the only two people there, and he wouldn't have been able to leave the kitchen without me noticing, since there's only one pathway between the two rooms. There were no fans or open doors, and as stated before, all the windows were sealed shut. I remember the air feeling abnormally still as well, and getting an overwhelming sense of discomfort and dread upon re-entrance, as if I was being, watched. Up until this day, I still haven't been able to find any solid reasoning behind the occurrence, and truly believe that something strange made itself known that night. Around a year ago, my neighbors 3 doors down the street moved to a nearby town, and a new family moved in. The new tenants, we'll say, are a man in his late 40s, whose name I actually don't know, and a girl who is about 13 and is in the same school year as my brother. Apparently, he has numerous other kids from separate relationships, but the girl is the only one who lives with him. I'll quickly talk about the house and the area too, because it's probably worth knowing. My area is a very safe middle-class neighborhood. The same can be said for the house that this bloke bought. But I don't know what he's done to it, but he's built a deck which isn't colored or anything, and just looks like it's made out of old wood, and the front door is a complete separate color to the rest of the house too. Essentially, it sticks out like a sore thumb among all the other houses. Anyway, now I'd like to go through the events that me and my family have learned about or experienced with this guy before today. Everything I mention did not happen prior to his moving in. So not long after he moved in, a pair of trainers appeared on the power lines directly outside of his house. I live in a really safe area, but according to my uncle, who works for BT and used to be an electrician for another company prior to that, they can be signs of illegal stuff like drug dealings or gangs. Apparently workers who come in to remove them get threatened by whoever puts them there. Every few nights at about 1 a.m. to 1:30 a.m., a car always drives up, stops outside of his house, waits for a few minutes, and drives off. I stay up quite late normally, and I've caught them in the act a few times now. It's the same car every time, a blacked-out BMW. The driver and another passenger run out of the car with the engine running. They sprint to the man's door, and then one of them returns and drives off. Of the 4 or 5 times I've seen it, myself, it has been a man and a woman, with the man running back to the car at the end. Similarly to the last one, my family go out for walks regularly, and there's often numerous women sitting on his front step in the evenings when they go out for walks. They don't speak much to each other, and if they do, it isn't in English. This led us to believe that they might be immigrants, but that's up for speculation. On numerous occasions, my next-door neighbors, an older woman in her mid-50s, who I'll call S, her daughter A, and A's boyfriend D, walk A's dog around the nearby streets. Usually the dog walkers are S or D, and one day a few months ago, D was walking their dog when they heard screams coming from the house. He immediately went back home and called the police. I'm not sure what happened afterwards. But on another day, not long after it, was S walking the dog late at night. As she went past the bloke's house, she saw an unmarked car and a police van outside of his house, almost in a barrier shape around his driveway. I also don't know much about this either, unfortunately, but there's allegedly been a duvet cover hanging out of the bathroom window with stains on it. One of my neighbours, who I'll call Fish and Chip Man, he owns a fish and chip shop, who is the bloke's next door neighbour, speculated that it could be one of two things: a drug farm or a torture chamber. Torture chamber seems a bit far-fetched to me, and I don't buy it personally, but drug farm sounds plausible to me, considering the trainer situation too. There was a time around a month ago where my parents were at a nearby guitar festival which I was performing at. They ran into a very drunk man who said that he lived adjacent to the bloke on the other street parallel to ours. But my parents subtly sort of pressured this guy, who apparently had a whole number of stories himself. They were very similar to ours, but he's not affiliated with our street, so it's interesting to know that there's others around him who have noticed the same thing. But it's also very concerning to us for obvious reasons. Now, this is where I want to talk about yesterday's events. This is very hot too, so I'm prepared for half of this to be incorrect to some extent, but there's some things that we know for sure, some things are speculation, and hopefully we'll be able to tell what is what soon. So, I'll start with 2 nights ago. At around midnight, a woman started pounding on the man's door, screaming threats at him in the middle of the night. The man, presumably drunk, started shouting back through a window. Fish and chip man opened a window and shouted to the man to shut up because he's disrupting everything. The man shouted back to Fish and chip man something about rape allegations, which Fish and chip man responded to by saying that he was calling the police. For whatever reason, Fish and chip man never called the cops though. However, someone must have anyway, because at around 4 a.m. yesterday morning, he was arrested by the police. Why? I don't know. But his young kid was apparently being relocated to her grandparents or something. According to me, after 3 p.m. and my dad before that, from 4 a.m. to 8 p.m., there have been police vans parked in his driveway all day, at least 4 different officers on standby at all times, and both a marked and unmarked car have been stopped and staring all day. They've apparently been scanning and searching the house all day and only left in the late evening. I managed to watch the moment that the unmarked car arrived. 2 officers left it, took what looked to be an Asian woman in glasses out of the house and into the back seat of the car, and that car never came back. Apparently, at about noon, my other next-door neighbor, P, went to the officers and nonchalantly started pushing them for information. My dad's the one who's been keeping such a close eye on this, and quite a bit of this information has come from him. So when he saw P go engage in some friendly conversation, he, of course, was right out there in an instant. Afterwards, P took my dad into her house and gave her side. And this is what P thinks she knows. Firstly, the man has already had a criminal record which we were unaware of. There's also a possibility that he's been in jail in the past. The second, more concerning and more likely to be the truth, is that the bloke's father was a major criminal and is also still incarcerated. The most common and most believed theory is that he's a pedophile and also a sex offender. But here's the final point and the most concerning to all of us. He might be out now, and I looked outside at about 11 o'clock last night and realized that his car is missing from his driveway. Before writing this, his car was in the driveway and all the lights in his house were completely off. And this could mean one of 2 things. One, the more likely solution is that he has been released, has returned and has driven off somewhere. I don't know where he could have gone, but given his track record, so to speak, it's probably not good. And 2, he's still in the police station and they've taken the car away. I don't think that this is the case, however, as I feel like we would have heard a flatbed made its way down the quiet street at some point. In any case, if I find out anything more, then I'll definitely share it with you guys. As for me and my family, we're pretty freaked out by all of this, and we hope it's not some sort of a torture chamber like our neighbor theorizes. To start this off, I'd like to say that I don't live in a creepy house. It's old, I admit, but in the charming sort of way. It doesn't feel negative when you walk in. It feels like home, really. Always just home. So you can imagine my absolute shock when I was laying in bed alone this morning watching something watch me back. 4 a.m. this morning, my husband left our bed to go to the bathroom. Our room is decent sized, but from where the bed sits, you can sort of see one of the 2 windows in the room, the other one being covered by blinds and the TV. It being 4 a.m. in the summer, it's a bit light to where you can see outlines and curtains and things. We have no animals, by the way. So I laid in bed waiting for him to return so that we could cuddle when I blinked and suddenly saw movement in the dark. A dark mass in the shape of a head had moved over the top of the covers just enough to where I could make out the fact that it was moving. I froze because I thought that it was my husband at first. Sometimes when he gets up, he'll sit in the chair and put on the headphones and play video games to not wake me up when he can't go to sleep. And I thought that maybe he had just got back in and I just didn't hear the door open, and that's why he was sitting in the dark looking at me like that. So I asked him, "Why are you sitting on the floor?" A few seconds with my heart pounding, no answer, and then I heard the doorknob click, and as soon as my husband walked in, it ducked down and it just disappeared. I screamed, obviously, because, what the heck, right? And had him do a thorough search, but he didn't find any intruder. I still can't explain it, and I'm scared to go into my bedroom alone now. I experienced a lot of stuff, especially as a kid. I've been told that I had an aunt that had passed away in another life that was trying to look out for me, but I've never ever seen what I witnessed this morning. It did not make me feel safe at all. I've only ever spoken to a few close friends about this experience. When I was about 12 years old, me and my two younger brothers and my two younger cousins were playing outside at night. Our cousins came over to see us, and all of the adults were inside the home. We lived in a small trailer park in Texas at the time, and it was built either on top of or near indigenous land. We played outside a lot at that time, and there was a street light that shone over the part of the road that we were playing on, so it didn't feel like creepy or dangerous or anything. I looked down the road where a white house sat, and next to it was a garage, and next to that was the forest. And there was a lot of forest in this area, in fact. And I noticed something coming out of the forest. I thought it was a wolf for a brief moment, but then I felt my heart sink when I saw its distorted-looking, long, thin limbs, and the uncanny way that it moved brought tears to my eyes almost. It had a long head and a small mouth like a horse, tan in color, and it was extremely thin and had no tail. It was weird looking, and as soon as I saw it, I knew that something was wrong. I grabbed my cousins and told them to look where I was pointing and asked if they could see it too, or if I was crazy. They had a terrified look on their faces and said yes, and I looked over it where I saw the creature, and it got up and started walking on its two hind legs and moved in such a weird way. It began to climb the garage with ease, and this thing had to have been around at least 8 to 10 feet tall while standing on its back legs. I then ordered everyone to run inside. I told the adults what we saw, and obviously they didn't believe us for whatever reason. I assumed that they thought that it was our imaginations. And anyways, I haven't seen these cousins since the encounter due to family issues. I've searched the internet many times trying to find a sighting or a report or an image that resembles this creature, to which I've really had no luck. So now I'm turning to here. If you've seen anything like this, then please let me know. If you know anything about what we saw that night, then please leave a comment below. Or if you've seen something like this, I would love to talk to you. Listening to some stories here, it's reminded me of an event that occurred about a month ago behind my home. For some background, I live in the Bridgewater Triangle, near the Hockomock Swamp. If anyone isn't familiar with the area or strange events that have occurred, it's well worth the deep dive and you should look it up sometime. But to make a very long story short, about 350 years ago, King Philip's War was fought between the colonists and the natives living in the area. The conflict lasted 3 years from 1675 to 1678, killing nearly 5,000 natives and the colonists during that span as well. At the time, many of the deceased were buried in the neighboring swamps and forests with unmarked graves, and over the years the area has been a hotbed for paranormal activity, such as apparitions, thunderbirds, Sasquatch and UFOs, just to name a few. Anyway, on to my story now. So, it was a typical cool summer night when I came home from the gym at around 11:40 p.m. on a weeknight. I jumped out of my car and headed for the back door when I began to hear the sound of drums coming from the direction of the woods. My house is the last on the street, closest to the town river and adjacent to the swamp or deep wooded area. The closest house through the woods is about 8 miles away, and I've never heard them to this point, as I've lived in this home since 2014. So, naturally, I sort of walked towards the tree line to identify the source of the sound. The drums sounded very basic, like a hand drum maybe, and it played in a very methodical, rhythmic, sort of almost tribal beat. But what happened next, I really can't fully explain. You see, as I began to get closer to the woods, staring into the darkness, the volume of the drums began to raise and lower at random. It didn't sound like the drum's volume was being adjusted. Instead, it sounded like the drums were moving. Like whoever was playing the drums was sprinting through the woods at an inhumane rate of speed, causing the drums to sound as close as 50 yards to as far as about 150 yards away in mere milliseconds. Only the dim driveway spotlight illuminated behind me as I stood alone in the dark. And in that moment, a feeling of just dread washed over my body. So I began slowly walking backwards, never turning my back to the moving sound that I was still hearing. I stepped through the kitchen door, wondering if I had made the experience up. To this day, I can only guess at what I had heard that night. The rational explanations don't seem to add up, but I've always been fascinated in the paranormal and had not experienced anything definitive, I guess you could say, until I moved to this area. I do plan on sharing some of my other experiences at some point if there's interest, but anyway, this happened and it's something that'll stick with me, I think. Today's episode is sponsored by June's Journey. Find your first clue by downloading June's Journey today. Available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. I've been an avid camper most of my life, and more that I actually lived in the Wyoming wilderness for almost 2 years as a child, in a house on a nature preserve. It was a place where electricity was only available by generator, and we had to boil water that me and my siblings carried up from the creek. All of this was before I was even 10 years old, and if there were emergencies, it would be at least an hour before we could get to help or help could get to us. I've hunted dangerous game before as well. Not particularly proud of it, to be honest, but it happened. And also seen some weird stuff in the desert. So when I say that I will not venture into the woods of the Cascadia mountain range alone, it's important to know that the wilderness doesn't frighten me easily. So I was 23 years old when a friend of mine, his name was Darren, invited me to a camping trip. The site was a place a few miles up a logging road, so about an hour-long hike from an already back road of a back road. It was just me, Darren, and his good friend Wade. The place was, from the logging road, about 10 minutes down a trail. The moment that we got to the site, I was excited. The small lake was beautiful, barely touched by people over the years. It also comforted me somewhat when we got there to see that within the last month, at least somebody else had camped out there, extra wood by the fire pit. We ate a bunch of chili and hot dogs, but around dusk the guys went off into the woods and they came back with a sealed bucket that they had buried the year before, and we opened it to get some of the MREs that we had stowed in their cache there. It was all in all looking to be one of the better camping trips that I've had in my adult life. That night, though, was a bit different. For the first time in my life, I felt, an uneasiness sleeping in my tent. I couldn't quite place it, but chalked it up to just not being used to camping without my dad. Darren bought his .38 special for protection from predators, but he was the only one armed. Anyway, the next day it rained, as it does in the PNW, and we tried to wait it out, but eventually called it quits, packed up, and we just went home. But fast forward to the next year, me and Darren get the itch to go camping again, and I wanted to give that site another shot. In fact, I spent a great deal of effort convincing a bunch of my friends to tag along. In the end, it wound up being 6 of us and a big white German Shepherd. Me, Darren, Wade, James, Charles, and Rita, James's girlfriend, and Moogie, the dog. Knowing about the uneasiness felt the last time, though, I brought my 12 gauge this time. James wanted to get some unregulated target practice in as well, shooting stuff that they don't allow at official gun ranges, like full cans and gallon jugs and stuff. We also brought a quad with us this time so that we could haul a bunch of extra water, booze, and other supplies to make our weekend more comfortable. The first day, though, as we're setting up, we hear a loudspeaker playing some music over by the south end of the lake, which was basically right next to the logging road, and this could be seen from the road, unlike the year prior. So, deciding that we're just being, Americans, me and James saunter down to meet the source of the noise pollution. Now, I have to commend the coolness of the cop that was just having a fishing trip, when 2 large, armed men, me with the 12 gauge, James with his 308, emerged from the tree line. We introduced ourselves, though, mentioned the others, but not exactly where we were camping, just that it was nearby. And that was when stuff got creepy. It could have just been cops doing cop stuff, but this guy really wanted to know exactly where we were going to be. Then he mentioned his favorite spots nearby, and really, really wanted us to try these other 2 spots more miles down the logging road. At that point, it was almost like, he was suggesting that that was the only spot where we wouldn't be in trouble. Darren showed up finally, though, told us that he spoke to the landowner several years ago and they were fine with us being there. And the cop was mad, but we lied and said that we'd check out the site that he was pushing. None of us trusted the guy when we left, so we decided not to in the end. It was, like a horror movie setup almost. The whole shady cop tells us to go to the spot where his hillbilly friends are going to kidnap us kind of vibe. So we move on, though, pretty early in the day, so we set up our stuff, get a fire going. We float around in our giant 4-person inflatable chairboat thing. The biggest highlight of the day was Charles cut down an entire dead tree with nothing but a small axe, like the midway point between a hatchet and a fireman's axe, I guess, but it was an impressive feat of stamina and strength. It was a good day leading into a good night, but right after it got dark, again, I just felt uneasy. The first thing that worried me was a couple of us heard something big splash into the far side of the lake. We thought maybe that it was Moogie, but he was by the fire at this point, his head now perked up and looking in the direction of the splash. Since we were pretty drunk, we thought maybe the floaty thing might just be compromised, so we went down with the flashlights to pull it out of the water and onto the bank. And then we heard the owl. Charles, Wade, and Darren were already passed out by midnight. Rita was humming along by the fireplace with Moogie, and me and James were out getting some more wood so the fire would last all night, when we heard an owl start up its hooting. It was a cadence that I was familiar with in this area, but something was off about it. I have a bit of a gift for mimicking bird noises, so what I noticed immediately is the ending hoot was sort of off. It almost always sounds like the owl is rolling its R's as the final hoot of the sequence goes. James, not really as outdoorsy as me, says, "That almost sounds like a person, you know." We end up joking, listen to it a couple more times, then I do my own attempt at an owl noise. Silence. For a few minutes, just as I'm thinking that makes sense because of the noises, it starts up again, but not just one owl. Another started up about half a second after the first, the new owl sounding more like an actual owl than the first one that seemed to have started up again. And after the first hoot from the real owl, the fake one stopped short. James jokes again and says, "Did that owl just tell the other owl to shut up?" I decided to shout, "Better listen to your wife, dude." Immediately after I shout, we both hear a loud crashing though, almost identical to the sound of the tree falling that Charles did earlier that day. And at this, Moogie starts to go absolutely berserk, barking and growling. He had a stink gland issue at this point still, so he was releasing that nastiness as well, and he was threatened, and luckily Rita was there to keep him from bolting. Big as he was, if he really wanted to move, she wouldn't have been able to do much. But I'm absolutely in fear at this point. I will reiterate too that I have hunted mountain lions and bears in my life, and at no point during those hunts was I as shaken and genuinely afraid as this. I was paralyzed for like an entire minute. I shout across the lake, "Whoever that is, you better get lost because we have plenty of guns." Then silence again. Luckily too for the rest of the night. I didn't fall asleep until Darren woke up, basically at sunrise, so I missed breakfast and a morning dunk in the lake. The others all did before I got up, needing to go to the toilet real bad. James had already explained the noises to the others by the time that we were all ready for our different adventures. Darren, Wade, and Rita just wanted to listen to the radio and chill. Moogie had run off just after lunch, and we decided to go look for him while also investigating the area of the noises last night. But almost immediately, when we get to the other side of the lake, the hair stands up on the back of my neck. Charles also feels creeped out, but he had an axe. I had a shotgun, and James also had a rifle and his .45 holstered on his hip. So we pressed onwards, looking for probably a couple of hours. I was mainly trying to see if we could spot any trees that had fallen, but then we made it to the eastern bank of the lake, and we were camped on the western side. "What the?" Charles says, causing me and James to come rushing over. There, we saw what looked like a human footprint, just one, but it was very clearly a footprint in the mud, even had a little pool of water still in it too. Now, to be honest, my first thought was Bigfoot, so I took off my boot and compared sizes. I'm a pretty big guy with pretty large feet as well, so it wasn't a surprise that my clodhoppers dwarfed this footprint when I put my own print down next to it. But what was weird was that the other print, where the pinky toe would be, looked like, I don't know, like another big toe maybe. We also found several downed trees, but none that looked recent, so we decided to go around to the North Lake and back to the others and do a sort of full circle around. Moogie was fine, and as soon as food smells filled the air, he came running back. And we all had a pretty good day again, to be honest. Drinking, feasting, and making fun of each other for being paranoid. We heard some gunshots a little close that day and then called out to warn the shooters that there were people and animals nearby. The shooters of us actually went to meet the people, and all of us but Darren and Wade joined the old guy and his wife shooting at whatever we could. Part of me was thinking that anything that was lurking around here sure as heck would not mess with us now. But boy, was I completely wrong about that. So, a brief mention about Charles. Ever since we were kids, Charles has had vivid night terrors. Most of the time, it's just funny, but some of the time it's actually a bit scary. He'd full-on sleepwalk as well and have conversations with you even while still asleep, but anyway, we had all gone to bed and I was one of the first due to getting like 4 hours sleep and being quite rum drunk at this point. Hey, who's that? Captain, stay in your tent. Charles, who was sleeping on a tarp by the fire instead of in a tent, said, or I should say shouted at this point. I shot up, grabbed the shotgun and turned on my flashlight. What's wrong? I shout. Adrenaline filled my entire existence. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Come closer to the fire. No, don't crouch down. Use your words. He keeps shouting. Finally, stirring awake James and Rita, who were in the tent closest to Charles. What the? James calls out. Moogie starts growling and apparently let off the stink gland again in their tent because him and Rita are like, oh, Moog, gross, but then I hear, there's somebody sneaking up on Captain's tent. Get out here. I start to unzip my tent. Not you, Captain. Stay in there. He's right next to you. Now, everybody else to this day denies hearing this, but I swear that I heard something whisper Captain before hearing a twig crunch right outside of my tent. James makes it out of his tent, and seconds later, I hear him laughing. It's just the water stump. Charles is having a night terror. But then, Charles claimed that he wasn't dreaming. When I got out and I shined the light on the stump, he agreed that that had to be it. We put one of those big sort of jugs of water on the top of a stump, and it could easily be mistaken for a white shirt standing in the dark. Satisfied too that there wasn't actually anything there, despite my protests, we all went back to bed. Charles stayed in the tent for the rest of the night, and I decided to spend the rest of the night on watch. That, though, was one of, if not the most terrifying nights of my life, because I heard more activity in those woods than I had heard before. Moogie, too, would wake up and barf multiple times as I'd hear twigs snapping off in the trees. Then I heard a really big snap that had to have only been about 10 feet away. At that, I jumped to my feet, whipped over to where the noise was, and shined my light. Now, I've seen enough deer butt in my life to know what I saw running from me. What was not normal of the deer, however, is that they don't stand up and run off on their two legs like that. Moogie howled and snarled. I took aim, letting my light drop, and I just fired. I didn't care that it turned to run. I just unloaded. There were booms straight until I ran out of all 6 shells that I had loaded. Everyone else was freaking out and rushed out of their tents. I told them what happened, and after that, nobody went back to bed until the morning. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night, and I think Moogie refusing to leave the tent was what allowed the others to take me seriously enough. He was a brave dog after all, sweet, and if other dogs messed with him at the park, he knew how to throw down, but this night, he was different. The last thing that happened too on that last day was that Darren and Wade went to go bury the bucket after putting some fresh new supplies in it. They'd always known where the cache was buried because there was a different stump that they used as a landmark, and that entire stump was just gone. It was there when we retrieved the cache 2 days prior, but now it had vanished. No signs of it being uprooted, mind you, dragged, or even disturbed. It simply was as if it just never existed. We genuinely all thought that we had just made a mistake too, until we found the hole for the bucket that we'd made before, still dug and with the little poncho stuffed in it. And that just made absolutely no sense to us. Well, I'm never coming back here now, so we may as well take this stuff with us, Darren said, and after that we all agreed and we all just left after lunch. So, that is why I will never go hiking in the Cascade Wilderness, at least without a firearm, and at least 2 other people who know how to use them. I don't know what all that was about that night when we were camping at that place, but whatever it was, I'll never forget it. Some folks don't stop searching until they find the truth. And if you've got the eye of a detective, June's Journey is the game for you. Play as the intrepid June Parker and follow her story to solve the death of her sister. You'll hunt for clues in hundreds of beautifully illustrated scenes to uncover new clues in this thrilling murder mystery set in the Roaring '20s. I really enjoyed playing this game too in my spare time. It sort of reminds me of one of those old school finder books where you have to look for a bunch of different things or people. But the really interesting thing about this particular game is that you're doing this in the midst of a murder mystery, so you have to find clues that assist with solving a crime. I also really like some of the unique features, like the ability to build your own island estate with expansive gardens and beautiful buildings. But I especially love the contest for short stories, which allows you to even win some prizes. I know some of you listeners are pretty gifted writers, so for you guys, it's worth checking out for sure. All in all too, it's a really fun game that has kept me coming back for more during my downtime on my phone when I'm between tasks and chores and have a spare minute or two. I only started recently too, so I'm on chapter 3 now, and at the moment, I'm continuing with Claire and Harry Van Buren's homicide. It's free to download and is a great way to unwind if you enjoy puzzles like I do. So, find your first clue by downloading June's Journey today, available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. So this happened 10 years ago now, but I still remember it vividly. This was when I was 18 years old and lived with my parents and siblings in a small town that was right near the Rocky Mountains in Canada. It was summertime and maybe about 11:30 at night. It was a clear night with good visibility too. We no longer live in that town, but we aren't too far from it now too. My friend, who was 17 at the time, also lived with us, and she was with me and saw what I saw as well. So, at the time, my family and I were part of what we have now come to know as a cult. This is relevant to the story because it was why we were out late, and my parents' door was locked as well. Me and my friend were told that we had to live with the leaders of the cult at this time. It's irrelevant to go into why for this story, but the cult leader's house was across the back alleyway and a few houses down from the parents' house. We didn't want to live with them, so we would spend as much time as possible at my parents' house and leave very late at night to go to the cult leader's house. Like I said too, it was around 11:30 at night, summertime, clear night. We leave my parents' back door to head to the cult leader's house. My mum locks the door behind us, turns off the lights, and I assume goes to bed. My friend and I walk out through our backyard and are in the alleyway. Our backyard has no fence to it, it just goes straight into the alleyway. But we turn left as the cult leader's house is a few houses down and across the alleyway, with a sort of slow incline and a bend. I'm hoping that makes visual sense, but behind us, the alleyway stretches a good 5 or so houses back, straight. And right as we step into the alleyway, we hear garbage cans from behind us, about a few houses distance behind us, being knocked around. I can only describe this like, imagine someone clumsily knocking into them and trying to stop them from falling down, but they keep knocking them in any case. Because we live right near the mountains, we're used to a ton of wildlife in the town. Bears, cougars, sometimes even moose. So my initial instinct is that it's a bear and we've startled it while it was getting into someone's garbage. I immediately panic and am wondering if we go back through the yard and bang on my parents' back door that's locked, or if we make a quick break for the cult house because it's most certainly unlocked. I'm making these calculations very split second because it's all happening so quickly. My friend starts saying my name over and over and grabbing my arm. She's looking back towards the garbage cans while I'm trying to plan what to do. Then, all of a sudden, She screams, and I look over my shoulder without really any time to think or process at all. And then I see it. It was huge and flying. It swooped over our heads, maybe 4 feet above us, and continued up higher, maybe getting to about 15 feet. Again, no time to think. We were both just screaming and yelling at this point. But here's the kicker. It flew right towards the cult leader's house. It banked between cult leader's house and the house beside it, and flew out of sight. When it banked, we had a really clear view of it too, as the streetlights across the alleyway sort of illuminated it well. And I'll describe what it looked like and how, to this day, I just cannot fathom that it could be anything other than paranormal. So its wingspan was about 8 to 9 feet long, maybe larger even. It was inky black. I mean, just totally the darkest black that I can describe. I've never seen anything like it before or since, color-wise. It had no distinguishable features, no feathers, no head, no eyes, no beak, no legs, nothing. The best way that I can describe it, in fact, is that if you imagine sort of like a huge stingray, minus the tail and much, much larger, longer wings. My friend describes it like, imagine a shadow of a large flying creature, but a much more solid, darker shadow. It wasn't transparent. Like, if you touched it, you would feel it for sure, or at least you would think you would. Mind you, it made no sound, other than the smashing of the garbage cans, so it definitely was a physical being, and flew so beautifully, so smoothly, I guess you could say. The way it banked between the houses was so effortless, and with it being so large, it was impressive. Anyway, we were totally stunned, shocked, and really, really frightened. We stood there for a short time watching to see if it would come back, but it never did. Eventually, we gathered ourselves and decided to go to the cult house, even though that was the way the creature went, because the door would be unlocked. And when we got inside, we immediately went to one of the leaders. It was the woman. There were two, a man and a woman, and told her everything as best as we could, totally freaked out and shaken up. And when we were finished, she paused and looked at us for a while with a strange look on her face, and simply said, and I remember this verbatim, "Where there is great light, there will be great darkness." And then she just walked off. My friend and I stayed up for hours by the front door looking out, wondering if we would see it again, but we never did, and we never actually saw it again afterwards either. I have, since that experience, attempted to Google on quite a few occasions, and really haven't found anything even remotely similar to what we saw that night. So, I guess my question for all of you guys is, has anyone potentially seen anything like this? Or does anyone have any insight? If you do, then I would love to hear from you. Also, thank you a lot for hearing me out. So this happened to me as a teen. I must have been about 16 years old at the time, so maybe about 12 years ago. My sister and I were having two friends stay over for a sleepover one night. It was in the middle of the summer and we lived in a tiny town, actually a hamlet. It was surrounded by prairies, lots of farmland. My sister and the one friend, they fell asleep fairly early on in the night, but my other friend and I stayed awake chatting for a while. We had our mattress on the floor, right by the three big windows in my sister's room. We're on the second floor. These windows looked out to the street below, and then across the street, to our left, was an elementary school. The parking lot for that school was in the middle of our view, and then next to the parking lot, more towards our right, was a farmer's field. So we stay up chatting until 2:33 in the morning. Windows are wide open as there's a lovely warm breeze coming in. And suddenly, my friend stops the conversation and says something like, "Oh, who's that?" I follow her gaze and see that she's looking toward the farmer's field. I see two figures coming out of the field. It's obviously dark and they haven't yet come into the streetlights, so I can't make out any features yet, but I assume it's just some of the kids in the neighborhood. My friend and I continue to watch in silence as these two people make their way into the streetlights and start coming directly toward the house. Now, I really assume that it's someone that I know because there's a few teen boys that would often be out late and would come to the house and talk to me and my sister from the window sometimes. As they're getting closer, we begin to make out their appearance, and I was absolutely shocked at how they looked. These two individuals couldn't have been taller than 5 feet. They were identical in all features that we could make out anyway, and I mean absolutely identical. They were both Caucasian, white-colored. They both had totally bald heads, and they were both wearing the same long brown robe with a tie at the waist. How I would describe it is that they sort of looked like they were in monk attire, I guess. They honestly just looked like little people. Even though they clearly don't look like anyone that I know, as they're coming towards the house, I begin to call out to them in a sort of loud whisper like, hey you, and then I start yelling out names of the different people in town that I know. I think I was in a bit of disbelief and thought that maybe it was a prank or something. All the while, my friend is totally stunned into silence. These beings make it just up to my parents' cars parked outside, so we have a very clear view of them at this point. And then they immediately turn on themselves and go back in the direction towards the field. They never once acknowledged my calls, too. They didn't even seem to look up. But they also appeared to be in discussion with each other, though my friend and I didn't make out any sounds coming from them. We continue to watch them make their way back across the road, and then, instead of going back into the field, they start walking down the road. We watch them until, well, we can just no longer see them. If you follow that specific road, it just leads to more fields, mind you, and away from any houses. My friend and I stayed up for another hour talking about what the heck we saw. She's a pretty devout Christian, so believes that it was demonic. Me, personally, I have no idea. It very well could have been demonic, I suppose, but it's also just so, I don't know, random. The next day, we told everyone, and they all seemed kind of freaked out by it, even my parents. And I just have so many questions. Like, why did they come towards the house, only then to turn back on themselves? I've wondered if they intentionally did it. Like, they knew that we were there and wanted us to see them or something. Why were their appearances absolutely identical? Why bald, short? Why the brown robes? Also, what's up with them being out at like 3 a.m. in a field? I have Googled and I haven't been able to find much. I did find an obscure YouTube video of a lady saying that she was visited by 7 beings that sound exactly like what my friend and I saw, but I haven't found anything else. This lady said that they're interdimensional beings that know the future, apparently. I don't know about that, but anyways, I would love to hear if anybody else has seen these beings or what your thoughts are. And thanks for listening. So, some other people have asked me to share more of my experiences regarding the time that I spent in the cult, paranormal encounters that started happening in the home, and when we moved to the same town as the leaders, even more started to happen too. To recap, I've shared some experiences already. The first was when my friend and I saw 2 small beings coming out of a field at 3 a.m. in long brown robes with bald heads, identical to each other. The second experience was when another friend and fellow cult member and I saw a large, blacker-than-black being fly over our heads. It was formless and about 8 to 9 feet across. And when I say formless, I mean it had no distinguishable features, no head or eyes or arms or legs or anything. This happened in the alleyway between our house and the cult leader's house too. So, another experience that I had was a little different to those. During our time in the cult, the leaders decided that I should move in with them. I think I mentioned this in a previous story too. They had 5 teenage girls living there at the time. I was one of them. One evening, I was doing my homework on the kitchen table with the same friend who saw that flying black creature with me. when suddenly, out of nowhere, my back started stinging. And I mean really burning sort of stinging. I was irritated by it and was trying to reach around to feel what was going on. Finally, after a minute or so, I asked my friend to have a look as it was really starting to bug me. I roll up my shirt and she stares at my back in confusion. I ask her what she sees and she tells me that I have 3 long scratches down my back. They look like cat scratches, but much too big to be a cat scratch. The scratches were spaced apart too wide to be a cat, and they also didn't have a cat anyway. She seemed quite freaked out by it, so I go to the bathroom to view it myself. They're pretty much centered down my back, and also behind my bra strap, and there was just no way that I could reach that. To be honest, I wasn't too worried at the time though. I mean, I just figured that it had somehow happened earlier and I was only feeling it then for some reason. But then this happened again, a couple of months later approximately. I was playing a computer game at the desk in the room that me and 2 other girls shared, and when I felt that sting or burning sensation again, exactly like before as well. Again, I try to reach around and feel what was going on. I go to the bathroom and lift my shirt. I see 3 scratch marks again, very similar to the ones before, but not quite as long and a little off to the side this time. I was a little worried this time, but told myself that it must be due to the clothing that I'm wearing or something. I put it out of mind and never thought about it until years later when I heard about this phenomena happening to many others too. The next one happened before I moved out. My sister and I were in her room in the basement. It was late morning. And next to her room is the utility room and then the stairs going up. Her bedroom door was closed and we were just chatting and hanging out in her room. We were about to go upstairs when, out of nowhere, we hear this growl or roar coming from the utility room area. It wasn't like any growl that I can explain because it wasn't like a dog growl or a big cat growl or anything. If I had to describe it though, it had that sort of deep low sound of a large cat, like a lion or a tiger perhaps. And it had a similar volume to a large cat as well, but maybe closer to a bear maybe? It's hard to explain, but when I first heard it, I was so confused and immediately frightened, obviously. My mind was racing, wondering how on earth I was hearing what sounded like a wild animal in the house. We didn't have a dog either, by the way, but then my mind went to, it must be someone walking a large aggressive dog outside, even though it didn't sound like a dog, and the sound is carrying through the walls weirdly or something. I was trying to make sense of it is what I'm saying, but something primal inside kicked off, I think, and because I became filled with dread, the growling got louder and it sounded like it was making its way towards her door. I looked to my sister with panic and see that she is frozen on the spot. Her face was filled with fear and also confusion. I remember actually wanting to escape out of her bedroom window at that point. My sister told me to stop and be quiet, but I couldn't. The growling was getting louder and closer and seemed to be right outside the door now. I couldn't just do nothing as well, so I started screaming for my mum, just calling out to her over and over. The growling immediately stopped when I did that too. I keep my screaming up for a minute or so and then I stop and we listen. There's no growling anymore and it's totally silent. My heart is pounding and I tell my sister that we have to run out. She tries to stop me, but I open the door anyway. I quickly look around and we don't see anything, so I race upstairs with my sister right behind me. We run to my mum and we tell her. Another incident that happened involved a time again when I was in my sister's room. I had decided to sleep in her room that night. We had just gotten into bed and were talking. And almost as soon as our conversation ended, when the room was totally silent, a voice came from the end of the bed and broke that silence. It was a loud whisper, and it said my name as clear as day, just my name, nothing else. I couldn't tell if the voice was male or female, but it was just a very loud whisper. I immediately grabbed my sister and said her name. I was completely freaked out, obviously, and she responded right away and said, I heard it too. At that, I was terrified. I clung to her, trying to process what we heard and what could be the possible cause, and she said that we mustn't give it attention. I couldn't stay there though, so I got up to get a glass of water and to calm down. I slept on the couch that night too, and I was just completely terrified the entire night. Anyway, I'll have to share more stories another time because this is already getting a bit long, but yeah, those are just some of the experiences that I had there at that cult. I still don't know how to explain many of them, but they are things that just stay with you, I guess. About 10 or so years ago, when I was a teen and still living with my parents, a very strange and creepy thing happened. In this particular house, we had all sorts of strange things going on. Too much to include now, but this particular incident was really unsettling. It was very late at night, maybe early morning hours even, very dark outside. The whole house was asleep. I have 4 siblings. My brother's room was across the hall from my parents' room, and my sisters and I slept in the basement. My parents awoke suddenly to the sound of my youngest brother's voice, 5 years old at that time, screaming out at my dad, just yelling, "Dad, Dad, Dad," over and over again in a loud and terrified voice. My dad jumps out of bed and rushes to my brother's room. It takes him all of like 3 seconds to get to my brother's room. When he opened the door, the yelling suddenly stopped. He saw both my little brothers fast asleep. He gently whispered to the brother whose voice that he had heard and tapped him to see if he was having a bad dream or something, but got no response. My dad thought that that was kind of weird, but just chalked it up to some kind of a nightmare or dream response. He walked back to his room, but no sooner did he get back into bed, literally the moment that he sat down on the mattress, they then heard my voice, this time screaming out to my mum, "Mum, Mum, Mum," over and over again. They said that I sounded completely terrified, just like how my brother sounded, and like I needed help, and that it was exactly my voice, just like it was exactly my brother's voice. But this time, the sound was coming from outside of their open bedroom window, where the backyard and the back alley is. My mum and dad looked at each other, perplexed. My mum jumped out of bed this time and decided to come and check on me in the basement, even though the voice was coming from outside. She makes her way down, and I remember this part. She woke me up in the room and asked me if I was calling out to her. I was groggy and tired and thought that she was being weird, and of course I said no, and I fell right back to sleep. As she's making her way back up the stairs, she hears my voice again, the same terrified voice screaming out to her, but from the front of the house this time. She stood by the big front window in the living room and looked out onto the street, but there was no one out there, not even a car driving by. It was totally still, and the screaming suddenly stopped. At that point, she knew that there was something sinister going on. She went back to bed, and her and my dad talked for a bit and prayed, and then they went to sleep. They didn't hear the voices again that night, but the next day she told us what happened, and obviously we were pretty terrified. She said that it was uncanny, the likeness to mine and my brother's voice. I even did an impression of what the voice could have sounded like, and my mum said yes, it was the exact same tone, sound, everything. So, I'm wondering if you guys have any theories as to why this happens, why these mimic beings take an interest in people. My gut says that it's just to mess with us and scare us, but I am curious as to what others think. So around 11 years ago, I was a telecoms engineer. A normal day went to a few residential houses, either fitted or fixed phone lines. Everything was no different from any other day. But then I downloaded my next job and I got a 20-line installation. Now, this is not the norm for the role that I had, as these tasks usually went to other teams, really. No issues though. I thought that it would be nice to be somewhere for longer than an hour or two, I guess. Better than being here and there and everywhere, I suppose. And I called the contact. It's a contact center who tells me that either the caretaker or manager of the building is aware and will explain what was required when I get there. So I arrive, and it's a really old building built in the 1920s, I later found out. I make my way in, tester and tool bag as is the norm, and after speaking with the receptionist, I discover that the building was at one point a nursing home, and after being derelict for a few years, it's now being used as offices for various businesses. As promised, 2 managers arrived to tell me that they think what I am looking for is in the cellar, as there's a lot of cables down there, and that's all that they really know. So I asked if the caretaker is about, as they usually know these types of things. I was told that he wasn't, as he was ill, but due back in the next day or 2. I follow this man and woman to a number padlocked door, and they open it, tell me the code, and on the other side of the door is a stairwell that just leads down to the cellar. So as we get down there, the light is pretty poor. In fact, it's really poor, I guess, but I have no chance of working like this, and I mean, there were lights, yes, but you're talking to pendant lights that weren't really great, and understanding this, the woman tells me that they have hanging lights, so no issues. I go back to the van, grab an extension, and head back towards the cellar. So as I'm passing the receptionist, she asked us, "Are you going to be in the cellar on your own?" So I just replied, "Yeah, sometimes you have to, but if what I'm looking for isn't there, I won't be for long, I guess." She laughed, but told me, "Better you than me. Nobody likes going down there, even for storage space." Now, I'll be honest, I just thought people don't like stairs to a dark place. No worries, but not something I'm unfamiliar with, so it just needs to be done. And after a quick look around with the make manager, we find a socket. I sort the lights, and yep, there is the DP that I'm looking for, but it's an older sort of solder block, no good for broadband, so I let him know that this is going to take a bit longer, and this is even before knowing where these 20 lines need to go. He just agrees and shows me where the office fitters have left all the cables for the clients, which to my relief was in the cupboard behind the receptionist. So all set, knowing what I know, I now crack on. I'm testing all the lines, and it's going pretty well. I've more than half gone through all the cabinets and a few shy, but I know the area and know from there I can get them through, as it's got 200 pair cables that run through it. At this point, it's around 4 o'clock, and I don't have the blocks that I need on the van, so tag up the cables and turn off all the lights on my way out before closing, and lock the door on the way out too. I sign out and tell the girl at the desk I'll see her tomorrow, and I leave. On my way home, I call my manager to tell them the script and that I may actually need a hand for half a day or more, as I'm not even sure anything has been done in the exchange yet. The next day, 8 a.m., I get a call from one of the other lads who tells me that he's with me all day, and that's all that he knows. We sort out a roll each, and I'll push the pairs from the box to the cab, and you do the cab and exchange if needed, and then it's just a case of fitting the box and running a large internal cable from the box to behind the receptionist. I make my way into the building once again, open the door with the code, and to my surprise, all the lights are on. Now, I am 100% sure that I turned them off, so I'm guessing one of the managers may have come to check if I was still there and left them on by mistake. I go down and do what I need to do and leave to push through the cables outside, call my mate, and he's getting them by one, and so it's all going well. I finish up and I head back to fit the block. As I grab the blocks, drill and all the bits and etc., set up mark for the pilot holes and just hear, "What are you doing?" After nearly jumping out of my skin, I turn and see this man with grey overalls on. So I say, "I'm just doing what's been asked of me. Are you the caretaker?" He replies that he is, and he says that nobody has been down here for years, and he was surprised that I was there. So I just cracked on, done the drilling, etc. And then as soon as I'd stopped with the drill and it was quieter, this guy just sort of started chatting away, like, "What football team do you support? Do you mind if I watch what you're doing?" I told him no worries and just tried to be polite as I could. He then told me that his name was Gordon and that he'd been working there for over 30 years. A bit confused, recalling that the receptionist had said that I told him that I was under the impression that this place had been empty for a few years, and looking at the cabling, it's been updated for at least 15 to 20 years. He just said that things are always happening here. After about an hour of back and forth while I'm working, I hear a hello from the top of the stairwell. Expecting Gordon to answer, I didn't. Then it came again, so I turned around and Gordon has gone now. I'm thinking that I've been waffling for 10 minutes and he's not even here. I pop up and it's one of the managers asking if I'm expecting somebody, another engineer, so I apologize and explain the phone signal isn't very good down there, so he probably hasn't been able to get a hold of me. All cleared, he comes down, we chat for 5, and he tells me that we'll start at the receptionist stand and work to me while I finish. After a quick toilet break, I go back down and I'm in the final stages now. I'm just putting phone numbers to pairs as for when my mate gets there, we can connect the test and go. As I'm doing this, I hear, "Sorry about that." Again, out of nowhere, it's Gordon. So I just acknowledge it, call him clever, and make a joke that if they can't find you, they can't ask you to do anything. I continue for 5 minutes and I've done all that I can, so I tell him that I'm just heading up to assist my mate and we'll be done soon and out of the way. Gordon then told me that he liked the company and it's been nice to talk. I felt saddened at this point, thinking that he was maybe treated poorly by people that I'm in the building with. So I just said, "Of course, mate, costs nothing to be nice and have a chat." So I go up the stairs, leaving Gordon down there and help get the cable through a void and into the cellar. 10-20 minutes of trying to fish it through, we got it and we go down, and Gordon is not around and we finish. My mate tells me it's time for food and he'll go to the chippy and meet me back at the yard, as I tell him that I just need a few signatures and to make sure the lights go back on so that I can get my extension lead. I get what I need from the manager's signatures and show him where the link is behind the reception. I inform him that I need to get my extension lead, so are the lights okay there for now and all that? Or does he want me to move them as we go and there's a good light? And he states that they might as well stay for now and he'll get another lead in case anybody else needs to go down there. I head down and start unplugging the lights, and Gordon appears again telling me that he didn't realize the lights were mine as he wouldn't have touched them. Straight away I thought, so that's why they were on this morning. But then it dawned on me that the door, it was locked. I asked him if he came down yesterday evening and he said, "Yes, of course, I'm always here. It's where I'm needed." Confused and just wanting to disappear at this point, I said, "No worries, nice to meet you," and I place my hand and put it to shake out. He just raises his hand and says, "Hope to see you soon." So that was a bit weird, but I left, signed out, and thought nothing of it. So weeks go by and I get a call from our control asking if I can return to this address as one of the lines isn't working and it's high level. So I say, yeah, no worries. I get there, say hello again to the receptionist. I asked if I could just check behind her first before having to go into the cellar. With some joy, it ends up being there. It just needs to be put on properly. And as I'm sorting it out, an older guy, he asks me if I was the one who was there last week. I say yes. He apologized and stated that he was the caretaker and had to take more days off than planned. I just told him, "Oh, don't worry about it, man. I'm sure Gordon will tell you where everything is." And as soon as I said this, he just looked me dead in the eyes and said, "What did you just say?" So I said, "Gordon. He told me that he's the caretaker here." This guy went absolutely white and just asked me if we could talk outside. So, of course, I followed him and he simply asked me if I believed in ghosts. Then he told me that before this was what it was today, it was a nursing home, and the old caretaker, his name was actually Gordon. He knew this as when the building was taken over, he found an old desk to do lists and letters and requests for a Gordon, and there was a sign on the door which said caretaker, and where this desk was, that door led to the cellar. I immediately rubbished this, obviously, and started laughing, thinking him and his mate were just pulling my leg. He then asked me, though, if he was wearing overalls, which I replied he was. He just sort of looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Listen, mate, I'm not lying. Gordon passed away years ago, supposedly on the job. I just thought you should know, and it's not something that's considered funny," telling me that he has been mocked as he has also seen Gordon, but people just have never believed him. And I never really said a thing to anybody beyond that. Until one night fishing with a friend, and just like he said, he thought that I was just messing around. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. I don't normally tell this to anybody as it's just not really worth the ridicule, but after this experience, all I can say is that I guess ghosts or spirits, they're real. On June 3rd, 2016, I had a social event. I was an Instagram influencer, and the event was a golf tournament. I posted on social to ask followers to come, so when he showed up, it didn't surprise me. Sure, the tickets were $250, but for some reason, that didn't click with me. It was a drinking event as well, and he showed up at least tipsy, but having a good time. He was also an Instagram model who I knew online. He asked me on a date for after the tournament. I was a single mum, and because of the event, my parents were watching the kid until the next day, so I said sure. We went off on the date, went to a bar and grabbed some food. The man was handsome, but mostly charming as heck. We had a beer, and then in his car he offered some weed. I rarely smoke, but decided what the heck that day. We hotboxed, then went off to a bar, and he was friendly with everyone and made me laugh quite a few times. Then off to the liquor store for more alcohol, and finally to his house. I was drunk and high, so it was easy to sleep with me. He had a bunk bed, and I remember him being on top and being very selfish and aggressive and being scared. I didn't stop him out of fear, though, and he had driven, and my car was still at the golf tournament location, and we were far too far for me to afford an Uber back to my car. The next morning, I went to the restroom, and afterward I noticed a long pipe coming from the toilet after I flushed. He came out upset because it was to water the weed him and his roommate were apparently growing, and I didn't know, or as too drunk or high still to click. I apologized deeply and was just honestly a bit scared. We came downstairs though, and I looked at the walls and the decor for the first time, and there were knives and weapons used as decorations all over the house. I waited for him to have breakfast and drive me back to my car, trying not to show my panic. In the car, I knew that I needed an excuse that wouldn't hurt his feelings, so I told him that I had a blast and I'm really bummed because I really like him, but my child's father passed away when he was 1, which was true, and I can't have CPS take him away because I'm around someone growing weed and all that. I told him that I didn't care about the weed and didn't want him to change, so it was a bummer, but I let him make out with me one last time as he dropped me off. I was shaking as I drove off because of the vibes, but the very next day, after he dropped me off, he met a girl that was 10 years our junior, and an 18-year-old mini-me, pretty much. He dated her for 3 weeks, she dumped him, and apparently he stalked her like crazy, so much so that he was arrested a few times. In September of the same year, he gets out of jail the last time and he heads to a bar, meets a girl there, and takes her home. And he ends up murdering her, and it is an absolutely gruesome story what happened to her. He's currently serving life for his crime, and I get flashbacks all the time about how that could have easily been me. The summer of 2008 was a really rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find out that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping. But that summer, it became an escape to the point of almost an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June though, and seasonably cold, wet and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I was going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funny enough, was to hike from Storm Lake, over Storm Lake Pass, and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving too. The road is a narrow 2-track winding its way through the thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and I decided to do some fishing. The fishing, it was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise, which was nice. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine, I guess, but there are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon too. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up in the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or further away, and the sound was above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was sort of stationary, I guess, and constant. This was most certainly not a plane or a truck or a bulldozer. And while all of this wasn't outright scary, nevertheless my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away and I was left again with only the sound of the raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and I headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout, so... it's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing, for me anyway. They just taste like mud, I guess, and I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast, too. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early here, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight as well. It was dark, in fact, really dark that night. The sounds of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort, and starting to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself that I needed to build up the fire before bed, so I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. But being away from the fire's crackling for a moment, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background again. It was growing louder than before and closer as well. I thought to myself that I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. This noise was ruining my camping trip and my buzz as well. So frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut up!" And like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. I will admit that at that, my heart skipped a beat. I realized that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it too. I threw all the logs on the fire and I retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sort of sat there, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment, I had felt alone but safe. Now, I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt as if there were a million eyes in that dark, watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again, Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour too. I was glad that I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. Unfortunately though, my tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but I knew that I would be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce, right? I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. This storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get into the pickup and drive away was even more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town, but I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy 2-track road, would have been a death sentence for sure, I thought. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. So, grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and I ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time that I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night though, so I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater thankfully, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain, and kept the campsite well lit. Now, I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. Then I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had suddenly stopped. In fact, it was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was now just embers. And the weirdest thing was that there was morning twilight to the east. I instantly looked at the truck's clock, and it now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye? I must have passed out or something. My head was killing me all of a sudden too. To be honest, I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and I stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was now completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. And smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and I tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. though before I finished picking up camp, and as I climbed into the cab of my truck, I then heard that rumbling again through the morning fog. As soon as I heard it, I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy bobsled track of a road, not once looking into the rearview mirror either. I have never been back to Storm Lake, and to be honest, I probably never will. So I was 10 years old, and back then, my friends and I would ride our bikes as far as we could, looking for adventure or to discover something new and exciting. At this time, my community was a mix of new and old, and it was easy to find an old tunnel, the remains of a farmhouse, or decayed paths and trails. So we set out that summer day with one extra boy than the usual crew. I had not formally met with him yet, but nevertheless we headed out on our bikes. We came across an abandoned house near a farmer's field and forest. We started to explore the premises, and we decided to settle here for a while. We walked in, checked things out, and we're just sort of hanging out and sharing our findings. But at some point, I started to hear the sound of rocks or gravel, or something like that, being moved through water, sort of like slurry, emanating from the basement. I thought that it was my friends playing in the house, and so I briefly ignored it. But suddenly there was wailing, and the sound of gravel was getting louder, like thrashing, like someone was throwing rocks of gravel or something. Frozen now, there was no way that my friends could make that noise. Then, all of a sudden, quite fast talking surrounded us. My one friend started to cry uncontrollably. His brother, a pretty brave kid, was preparing to protect his brother. Together, we could see inside the house's front hall and stairwells. The new boy was giggling and gesturing us to come downstairs by waving us in with his hand. But we stood there, dumbfounded. How or what was making that noise? How did he not know the immediate danger that we were in, that he was in? I wanted to get him as I thought that this was possibly his last moment on the planet, but I watched him return up from the dark stairwell leading to the basement. He was still giggling and mirroring the exact same motion. He returned again downstairs and out of sight. We screamed at him not to go, but he kept doing the exact same thing, just over and over again. He was actually sort of speeding up too, like 2 times and 3 times faster. The noises from the basement I can only really describe as just pure despair, like an agonizing, painful and doom-like quality, but they were human for sure, or at least human-like. We screamed at this guy, though, that we're leaving, and it seemed like he was coming outside with us. Frantic, we just started biking as fast as possible, petrified with fear, and I didn't look back. It was dusk now, and we had no time to reconvene, so we separated immediately and went home before we were grounded. I asked my friends the next day if anyone saw the other boy, and they responded that they thought that he was somebody else's friend from our group. We ended up talking for a little while, and we discovered that we didn't even know his name or where he came from, and after that, we actually never saw him again. So, I'm going to try and sort these events out chronologically. They happened between my 14 and 20 years of age. For context, I'm currently 22. The village in question is called Moczka. It's in Poland. I've also not lived there for like 2 years now, but an important thing that I want to mention is a warm friend of mine that I met here, Jacob. He will be crucial to several situations. So firstly, the forest itself was huge, although typical of forests in Poland, I guess. My friend and I often spent our free time there. The forest had no owner, and we loved exploring it. We built a small bridge by the stream so that we didn't have to go around it or jump over it. A few days after building it, too, when we were returning home from deeper parts of the forest, as if from a tree, a stone flew towards me, which almost hit me in the head. At the time, for a long time afterwards, we joked about it, although it was a pretty dangerous situation to be honest, because the rock was large enough probably to kill me if it hit me. Of course, we ignored it, not thinking too much of it, but it was harvest time, and as I remember, there were bales of hay in the fields at the time, which we loved to jump over. We chose fields that were more submerged in the woods so as not to risk being caught by the farmers. It was already getting dark, more slowly sunset, and on our return we saw a black figure behind a small stream, different from the first place. This forest repeatedly crossed by water. We looked at the figure for a while too, but couldn't quite make out what it was at the time. But we laughed and said that it must have been the figure that threw the stone that time. Thirdly, we saw this figure again, twice on another day, shortly after the previous incident, in the same areas. And fourthly, this is the last part where my friend was with me, and in the deeper parts of the forest we found something like rabbit holes, only bigger. We have seen rabbit dens quite often here, so I doubt that we would have been wrong, but nearby we found a traveling suitcase with strange things inside. From that moment on, too, my friend stopped attending this forest. I think something must have spooked him. I myself enjoyed running through the forest, in other parts of it, especially in the evening. I came across a phenomenon that I would mostly describe as earth-breathing, I guess you could say. In a certain area, the ground regularly rose and fell, and it was really cool to watch. But this is where things started to get weird. I covered my running route as usual, but on this day, I turned back. While running, I heard an unnatural growl from the bushes. Over the years, I've clocked wolves or foxes, but this sounded really different to that. There seemed to be nothing in the bushes too when I looked, But preferring not to tempt fate, I turned back and I went home. The growl itself was deep though and very bassy, and lastly, and probably the strangest thing, I was already of age and it was dark. It was one of the few trips after dark that I took, and I don't even remember what for, to be honest, but passing a long path in the woods, I heard not far away, but in the denser part of the forest, a kind of, I know this is going to sound weird, but choir. Something like church singing. I'm not an expert, but it sounded like it was in Latin, and so I ignored it, and going back after this time, obviously, I didn't hear anything anymore. But years later, my friend and I came to the conclusion that there was probably black masses or something of that nature going on in that forest. There were also often very suspicious cars hanging around in the area for years, and I'm not a big believer myself, but to be honest, it is a possible explanation. In the end, who knows what actually all of that was, but I don't think that I'm going to go back there, just in case. So about 5 years ago, when I was 17, I visited some of my family who lived in South Dakota and worked there for the summer. After about a month, my brother, sister, and her husband decided to do what Americans do best and go shoot guns in the woods. I had to work an evening shift, so it was decided that we'd go after around 10 p.m. Once my shift ended, we went to their house to pack up the truck with some snacks, guns, and ammo. The drive took around 45 minutes, and it took us up a dirt road surrounded by trees and tall grass. Eventually, it opened up into a clearing that was pretty open and flat. The nearest tree line was about 100 feet away. It was pretty dark, but the clearing was lit up by the truck's headlights. For some reason, too, I kind of felt a bit uneasy, but I chalked that up to just being in the woods at night. For the first 20 minutes, nothing really happened too. We were just setting up plastic bottles and those plastic gallon buckets that you get water out of at an office. But there was a feeling of being watched that we all felt, and the area suddenly just reeked of spoiled eggs. Those of you who have shotguns know what that smells like, but even since going to the military, no amount of guns, explosions have ever smelt this bad. We looked around to see if we could see the source of what it was, and what I saw, I can still vividly remember to this day. It was a thin humanoid figure crouching down, just looking at us. Even while crouching down, it was still above 6 feet in height. And when I say that this figure was thin, I mean skin and bones barely do it justice. The even weirder thing about this was, though, is that we all saw the figure in different spots in the tree line, but we all described the same features. Tall, thin, had long dark hair. Whatever the case, we quickly packed up what we could and we just left. And the feeling of dread that we felt that day will forever haunt me. Since then, my brother mentioned the area might have been in native territory, but I don't know if that's true or not. Every once in a while, I think back on that day and I look up different stories and encounters people have in those woods, but nothing ever quite resembles what I saw that day. In April 2019, I was an exchange student in South America. I went on a trip to the Amazon with a group of other exchange students. And while many strange things happened, I would like to focus on two in particular. So at the time, I was 18 years old, tall and thin and white with blue eyes, mentioned just because I always stood out as a tourist. I was fluent in Spanish, allowing me to talk to locals without misunderstandings. The first incident occurred on our first night or morning in the Colombian or Brazilian town of Leticia. We were all staying in a hotel, and it had a really strange vibe. I didn't feel comfortable, and neither did my friends. The hotel staff were staring at us like creeps, which made it even more scary. But during breakfast, I overheard other exchange students discussing a missing phone. I offered to help locate it using the Find My iPhone app, and we were able to track it down to a really sketchy part of town. The police accompanied us to the location and we found the house where the phone was. The family denied involvement, but their behavior and the fact that the phone signal was coming from their place made it clear to us that they had probably stolen it. They came out with knives and machetes, yelling and staring at us. It was really intense, and I felt a shiver down my spine, and I had a very strong gut feeling that we needed to leave. We told the police to back off and not to do anything about the phone because we were worried about our safety, and the phone just wasn't worth it. When we came back to the hotel, the police wanted to see if there were any cameras pointed at the door of the room from the outside of... When we came back to the hotel, the police wanted to see if there were any cameras pointed at the door of the room from the outside or the inside. The scary part is that they had cameras from the inside and outside, only these two cameras were mysteriously turned off for 2 hours that night. I also know about another incident and found out that the cameras were turned off by someone from the hotel staff. I really don't feel too comfortable sharing that, as it involved one of my friends. It was very serious and some legal actions were taken too. But one of our other stops was in a small village in Peru's part of the Amazon. I don't remember the town's name, but it had around 150 people, and the village was built on pillars above the water as the river Amazon was overflowing or something. After we arrived and settled in at the local hotel, we were taken to a stage where we were introduced to the region's indigenous dances, songs, and culture. After the performance, the group returned to the hotel, but I decided to stay back and talk to some of the locals. I wanted to see an anaconda, very dumb and touristy, I know, but someone had told me that this was a good time to see them hunt. I started talking to a local guy, and he claimed that he couldn't show me where to see a live anaconda, but offered to show me a picture of one that he had taken a few days ago on his phone. Now, despite what my parents always taught me about going to strangers' houses, I foolishly decided to follow him to this remote, isolated home deeper in the jungle. As we walked, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease and danger, though, lurking around every corner. When we arrived, he instructed me to wait in the living room while he searched for his phone, but as I stood alone in the dimly lit room, my gut told me that something was wrong. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was in grave danger all of a sudden. After what felt like an eternity, he returned and said that he couldn't find his phone. He asked me to come back the next day, but I knew that I had to get out of there as soon as I could. I thanked him and left, but my heart was pounding with fear and adrenaline. When I returned to the hotel and told my friends what had happened, they were horrified. They couldn't believe that I put myself in such a dangerous situation. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something terrible could have happened if I had stayed any longer. Looking back, I realized that the encounter was bizarre, even if he was truly just a kind person, but I just cannot shake off that feeling that something was about to happen to me. It scares me to think about how gullible I was back then. Even though I consider myself rational and sometimes even paranoid, I didn't listen to my instincts that day. And I genuinely think that I put myself in a lot of danger. So for some context, I live in a major city and currently I don't do a lot of driving due to ongoing issues with my car. Plus the pandemic has made me turn to more delivery apps in general. But the other day, around 1 p.m, I decided to order some lunch after doing a lot of cleaning. I placed the Uber Eats order and found something to watch while I waited for the food. Within a few minutes, a driver accepted the order, and I noticed right away that the driver, Anthony, was on a bike and didn't have a profile picture or any deliveries on record. At first, I wasn't really alarmed, to be honest. I mean, I was sort of amused, like, oh wow, I guess I'm this person's first ever customer. But then a full 30 minutes passes with no driver movement on the app, and at this point I think that maybe something is glitching out or the driver is stuck or something, so I contact support via the chat option, and they ended up assigning a new driver because they couldn't reach the first one. Odd, but whatever, right? But now is when things started getting a little weirder. The new driver assigned is in the exact same spot as the original driver was, and they're also on a bike. also have no profile picture and have no prior deliveries as well, and this driver's name was Laurie. I let another 20 minutes pass with no driver movements before I message them myself and say, "Hi there, are there any issues with the order?" The app shows that the driver saw the message, but no response. All this time I'm checking to see if Uber Eats is maybe experiencing issues. None that I could find though. And at this point, while I'm definitely weirded out, I'm mostly just hungry, so I contact support again to request some assistance. They reassign the driver again and apologize for the inconvenience. Same deal, they also tried to contact the driver with no response. And finally, the third driver assigned is the exact same scenario. Same spot, on a bike, no profile picture, no prior deliveries. Only this time, the name is Robert. And before I can react and go about cancelling the order at this point, because I'm tired of dealing with this, he suddenly has my food and immediately messages me the following: "Hello, have your food, what's your number?" And I respond right away with, "I'm not super comfortable giving my phone number out when you can just message me here." And he responded again with, "What's your number? Be there in 10. How old are you?" At this point, the alarm bells are going off, and I contact support immediately to have the order cancelled and get further assistance. I get connected to Uber's safety team, who informs me that the order has been cancelled, I'll be refunded, and started taking down the details of the strange interactions. As I'm giving the woman on the phone the info that she needs, I'm starting to calm down, thinking that this was just some creep or something went wrong, and that's when I hear a man's voice at the front door. "Miss, I have your food." And I can't even describe the chill that went down my spine because of the way that he said it. And making things even worse, the Uber safety woman on the phone with me heard him as well and goes, "Is that him? We cancelled the order though." I poked my head around the door. The main heavy door was open, metal screen door was closed or locked but allowed us to see each other. I get a look at him though, and when he saw me on the phone, he went from smiling to looking absolutely furious. He suddenly got right up against the door and kept asking who I was on the phone with, and at this point, I've started asking him to please leave because he's making me uncomfortable and he's getting more and more angry. And at this point, starts pounding on my door and grabbing the doorknob while shouting to be let in. The woman on the phone is asking if I'm okay. The man is still shouting, so basically I'm in full meltdown mode at this point and hurriedly close the heavy door to lock it. The man is becoming borderline belligerent as he kicks my door, and the woman tells me to call the police. He ended up walking away from my house about a minute after that and back up to the sidewalk. And for a moment, I thought that he messed up, so I finished my conversation with the Uber safety woman so she could submit the report. Once she submitted it, I called the police and told them what happened. They weren't incredibly helpful at first since he didn't actually break in or put his hands on me, and they told me that if he came back to call again and they would send an officer out. And I did end up having to call them again and give a full report, plus description of the man since he didn't end up leaving right away. He stayed in the neighborhood for almost 20 minutes in fact. According to one of my neighbors, after she heard the yelling, she saw the man that I described walk back up from my house to the sidewalk and hop into a truck with another man in the passenger seat. And they apparently just sat there staring at people walking by and being incredibly sketchy. And that's when she walked back towards my house and asked me what had happened. Luckily, she was able to give myself and the cop a description of the vehicle and the other man as well. But basically, this was a very bizarre and uncomfortable experience, and I wanted to share it, maybe to see if anyone else has had an experience like this. Because honestly, I'm still pretty shaken up by it, and will be avoiding delivery apps for quite a while after this. It was a really strange experience, and I have a feeling that there was more to it than just Uber Eats. So yesterday, I was on my way back home with truck parts that I had picked up and did what I do a lot of times. I opened up my map on my iPhone and started checking the countryside roads for any cemeteries that I wasn't aware of. I go to them and walk through and record audio and video for my own records. I located one on a narrow side road and went to the area. And when I got there, I discovered that it was on private property and would be a 10-minute walk through the field to get to it. Not wanting to upset the property owner or get in trouble too for trespassing, I went to a house that was next door back a long gravel lane. As I got closer to the house, it was obvious that it was not being lived in. It was a huge 2-story farmhouse that, in its day, would have been quite beautiful, I'm sure. I decided, though, to go ahead and knock on the door. I have seen people live in worse conditions and wanted to at least make the effort to knock on the door. I'm not gonna lie though, this place was unkempt and had a pretty creepy appearance. Tattered curtains on all the windows, a few windows had been broken, etc. Nevertheless, I opened the screen door and I knocked on the door. It swung open when I knocked, exposing that the house had appeared to have been quickly moved out of some years ago. Full of furniture, clothing laying on the floor. The kitchen was visible down the hall from the front door and you could see the table was still there. And at this, I decided to step into the threshold of the doorway and started recording with my iPhone. I yelled out hello several times, knowing that there would be no one living there, but still trying to make the effort, due diligence and all that. Within about 45 seconds of stepping in, I was hit full on front of my body with an air so cold that it was honestly like stepping outside in the winter night with just shorts on. It was extremely cold. Now, the outside temperature was about 60 degrees and had been very warm for several days. The house was not cold when I stepped in, mind you, but this cold air that hit me started to slowly move up my lower legs. Now, as this took place, my lower left leg, just above the ankle, began to feel as if I was being ate up by fire ants, but there were no ants anywhere. So I asked out loud, "If you're doing that to me, please stop because it hurts." And after asking several times and explaining that I was not there to do anything to the house or the property within it, the burning stopped. But that very cold air remained. I made my intentions very clear and never moved further into the house. I asked the usual questions and panned to my left and to my right, capturing each room off to my sides and the staircase that was directly in front of me. And just as I stated that I was going to leave and would maybe come back someday, I observed with the naked eye a misty apparition cross in front of me from right to left. It was also captured on my iPhone. I was by myself, I wasn't smoking. There was no fog or mist outside to somehow come into the house and move through the rooms. The house sits about 900 feet from the roadway and the door does not face the road, so it's not like a reflection from a car or anything, and there are no other houses close by anywhere. The feeling that accompanied this, though, was nothing but dark and ominous, and definitely did not feel friendly or welcoming. I have been to many cemeteries and other places over the years, and I've never witnessed anything like this. I am a somewhat skeptical person, I like to think at least, and always try to debunk anything that I get. But this one has me absolutely speechless. I will definitely be locating the owner, and I'll attempt to get permission for an investigation at some point, because I am sure that there is something there. This happened when I was 17. I'm a female and have lived in the same house my whole life. My mum is a private caretaker and used to work overnights when I was in high school. One night, I'm home alone like normal. It's around 3 a.m. and I was up hanging out and just doing my own thing. I loved having the house to myself, to be honest, but in our living room we have 2 windows, one in the front of the house that overlooks our yard next to the front door, and the other one overlooks our driveway and the side of the house. From the second window, you can see the side of our neighbor's house across the street. So I'm in my house, walking around listening to music, and I have all the lights on in the house. I'm scared of the dark. The curtains on the windows overlooking our driveway are open, but I'm not concerned at that moment. I keep walking back and forth between my room and the kitchen doing stuff. You have to walk through the living room past that window to get to the kitchen. And about the 3rd time I'm walking through, I notice a light on the side of my neighbor's house moving. I stop and stare at it. It looks like a flashlight occasionally, and I notice what looks like a hand wearing a black glove fall into the frame of the light. I'm standing there confused, just staring at the light and the hand moving near the window, when all of a sudden the light shuts off. It finally connects in my head what's happening, so I run around my house turning off the light so I'm not visible inside the house anymore, and I duck down behind the couch under the window behind the curtain. I see what looks like a man in a black hoodie walking down my neighbor's driveway and onto the street. He turns and stops right in front of my driveway. My heart is pounding at this point. I knew that he saw me in the window earlier, and I'm scared that he's going to retaliate. Then, after what seems like forever, he turns away and walks past my house. I stayed frozen in that spot for what felt like hours, I think, and I never saw him again, thankfully. Eventually, I grabbed a kitchen knife, though, and I returned to my room. I told my mum about it the next morning, but she blew me off, saying that it was probably the people who live there, and ignored my concern. Lesson learned, I guess, is that I always make sure the curtains are shut from now on. But a weird thing was that whenever he was moving, he looked really stiff almost, like a robot, I guess. I never told my neighbors or called the cops either, which I probably should have, but I don't know why I didn't. I guess I just didn't want to blow things out of proportion. But I do wonder what he was thinking about when he was staring at me in my house while I was there, all alone, late at night. As with many, I've always been into the paranormal, but never really believed in any of it, I guess. I have sought out ways of experiencing paranormal things, but any time that I've had something, I have had a way of dismissing it, and could always just chalk it up to maybe a weird occurrence. But about a year ago, I switched roles in the museum that I work at. I've been here for 5 years now, and some weird things have happened in the past, but again, you could rule most of it out as just coincidences. But when I moved into the collections department, we're the people who take care of the objects and the artifacts in the museum's possession and on loans, things got weird, really quickly. Everyone talks about the museums being haunted, and it's understandable. I mean, we house and care for lots of really old, sometimes even creepy objects, and many of them have storied pasts, and our collection is roughly 200,000 pieces. We have some doozies too. But to make it short, I've been seeing shadows, hearing my name, and having lights turn off and on, and when I'm alone. Our storage is split into 3 areas. The upstairs mezzanine is home to our toy and puppet collections. Downstairs is 3 connected areas split into 2 rooms, textiles by itself and American materials and ethnographic or world objects in the main area. And the 3rd area is in a separate part of the museum, split into 2, and houses larger objects along with natural sciences. Now, the most convincing evidence I have experienced for the existence of paranormal activity happened about a month ago, and it's really stuck with me. To set the scene, I was in our textiles room, lower level storage, in a room off of the main area with the objects, in a room off of the main area with the world objects, returning some clothing that we had shown on our tour. To briefly explain the storage setup, you come down the stairs and can go left into the world objects, or right and take a turn into the American materials. However, the stairs are the only thing separating the areas, so the stairwell is more like a donut hole than anything, I guess. But turning left into world objects and immediately taking another left, that will let you walk perpendicular to the aisles of world objects and brings you to the right side of the American materials. On that right wall, looking out into the American materials, is the door into textiles. It's normal practice, like with most places, to only have lights on in an area that you're walking. So I had lights on at the base of the stairwell, the very front of world objects, and that illuminated enough of my path into the textiles room to see. Up until now, I had lights turn off, doors slam, heard my name, and had objects move. Basic things, but stuff that, honestly, I could ignore. I could look past them, or obviously just explain it away. But I went down the stairs into this area and was immediately overcome with just panic and anxiety. The room was cold and there was I don't know how to describe it, but just a bad energy, I guess. I turned around, sat in my office for a couple of minutes thinking that I was just having a panic attack and cooling off, and decided to just ignore it in the end. I went back down, hit the lights, beelined it into the textiles room, and started putting things back in place. But even here, I felt like I was being watched the entire time that I walked through the lower level. But again, I didn't think too much about it and figured that I was just being paranoid. But I just couldn't shake this gut feeling of paranoia, I guess. Then I left the room, and that's when it got bad. I opened the door, and I can see all the way across the American materials. The last shelving unit on the far wall from me is where we keep items from a famously deceased child. The family donated all of their belongings after their passing. There weren't any lights on in that area, but I could see someone. It looked like a fully grown man, probably around 6 feet tall, and the shape was hulking. But they were pitch black, like darker than any shadow of any of the room. I'm telling you guys too, with whatever oath that you want, that I could see this person that was darker than any unlit wall. And then, all of a sudden, it sprinted. I mean, absolutely ran as fast as I've ever seen anyone run, into the closest wall. Not at me, not to scare me, but sprinted to its right, which was maybe only about 10 feet away from it, into a cement wall. This all took place in about 5 seconds, and to be honest, I didn't know what to do, so in the end I just sort of stood there and then I ignored it. I just quickly walked out of the storage, flipped the lights, and I hauled it up the stairs. I got about halfway up the stairs too when the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I heard someone say my name, and the doorknob at the base of the stairs started to turn. I didn't even stop to listen, and I just got out of there as quickly as I could. Now, I'm sure that there's a way of explaining it. Again, I could have very much just been having a panic attack, but the anxiety went away just about as soon as I walked back up the stairs the first time. Since then, things have gotten stranger too, with objects moving in front of me and other people in departments or doors closing in front of us. Like I said, things have happened since I've been here, and there are plenty of stories of before I was in the department or at the museum. But this thing a month ago was just different. I'm only sharing this now too because, well, last night I had a dream where a ghost or something was holding my mouth closed and pushing on my back. And when I woke up, it seemed to be happening too. I feel like things are getting weirder and weirder with me, and I've been looking into shadow people or other sorts of weird apparitions for a little bit now, trying to figure out what all